The night air above the Nile River was still warm even after the sun had gone. Heat rested softly on the mud brick walls of the sleeping town, holding close the memory of the long day. Far away across the dark fields, frogs called from the riverbanks in slow and steady rhythms. Thin reeds moved gently beside the water. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden boat creaked against its rope as the river drifted quietly beneath the stars. Most homes were dark now. Families rested on woven mats spread across flat rooftops where the night breeze moved more freely. Children slept beside parents beneath simple linen cloths. Clay jars stood near sleeping places, filled earlier with cool river water. Sandals rested beside low doorways. Oil lamps had mostly burned out, leaving only faint orange light inside a few late working homes. The town itself seemed to breathe slowly in the darkness. Beyond the sleeping houses stood the great temple walls, pale beneath the moonlight. Their surfaces held the warmth of the day. Tall stone columns disappeared into shadow. The temple courtyards were quieter now than they had been at midday when workers carried baskets, priests crossed shaded walkways, and merchants waited outside with goods from distant villages. Tonight only a few figures remained awake within the temple grounds. One old guard sat beside a narrow doorway with a spear resting across his knees. His eyes were heavy with sleep. Nearby, a young temple servant swept dust from smooth stone floors by the light of a flickering lamp. The sound of the broom moved softly through the corridor like dry grass brushing against itself. Deep inside the temple, behind thick walls and painted halls, preparations for morning offerings had already begun. The work never truly stopped. Even while the town slept, ovens remained warm. Bakers prepared dough before dawn. Potters stacked fresh bowls for temple kitchens. Farmers sleeping outside the city walls would soon wake beside canals and animal pens. Fishermen resting near the riverbank would untie their boats in darkness long before sunrise. Every morning in ancient Egypt began with offerings. Food, drink, flowers, incense, oil, cloth, and sacred objects were carried carefully into temple chambers while the sky was still pale and gray. The gods were believed to awaken each day just as the people did. And because of this, many hands worked through the quiet hours before dawn so the rituals could happen without delay. Far from the grand halls where priests spoke sacred words, ordinary workers carried most of the burden. The baker who shaped heavy dough before sunrise. The brewer stirring thick barley mixtures in clay jars. The gardener cutting lotus flowers beside still water. The boy carrying baskets of onions through dusty streets. The old fishermen pulling wet nets onto shore in darkness. Their labor became part of the offering long before the priests lifted incense into the air. In one narrow alley near the edge of the town, a baker named Hori slowly opened his eyes. The night was not yet finished. Stars still filled the sky beyond the roof opening above him. Beside him, his wife and 2 children remained asleep beneath a thin woven blanket. For a moment he stayed still, listening. He heard distant dogs barking near the outer walls. Somewhere farther away came the dull sound of a donkey shifting against wooden posts. A faint breeze carried the smell of river mud and cooling ash from cooking fires that had died hours earlier. Hori rubbed dust from his eyes and sat upright slowly. His back ached from years of grinding grain and lifting sacks of flour. Even before standing, he already felt the heaviness of the coming day waiting for him. But the temple ovens would need bread before sunrise. Carefully, he stood and stepped across the floor without waking the children. The clay beneath his feet still held warmth from the day before. He tied a linen cloth around his waist and reached for a small oil lamp resting in a wall niche. The flame flickered weakly at first. Outside, the alley was narrow and silent. Mud brick walls rose closely together on either side. The stars above looked sharp and bright in the dark sky. Hori moved slowly through the sleeping town carrying the lamp in one hand. As he walked, he passed other homes where workers still rested before the early labor of morning. A fisherman slept beside rolled nets near a doorway. 2 donkeys stood tied beside baskets waiting for market goods. Near one corner, an old woman slept lightly beside jars of onions and lentils she would later sell outside the temple gates. The town smelled faintly of dust, dry reeds, and old smoke. Soon Hori reached the bakery courtyard attached to the temple kitchens. Already 2 younger workers were there grinding grain with heavy stone tools. Their movements were slow from exhaustion. The scraping sound of stone against grain filled the courtyard softly. No one spoke very much at this hour. The younger men nodded quietly as Hori entered. He moved toward the ovens built from clay and brick along one wall. Even now they still held heat from the previous day. Nearby stood baskets filled with emmer wheat and barley collected from temple fields along the Nile. Temple bread required enormous labor. Not only for the priests, but for workers, guards, servants, scribes, and laborers connected to the temple itself. Some loaves would become sacred offerings placed before the gods during the first rituals of mourning. Others would later feed the endless flow of people moving through the temple grounds. Hori began mixing flour with water in large clay bowls. His hands moved from memory more than thought. He had performed the same motions nearly every day since boyhood. Outside the courtyard walls, the sky remained dark. Nearby, another worker poured water carefully from heavy jars carried earlier from the Nile. Water splashed softly onto stone floors. The smell of damp grain slowly mixed with warm yeast and smoke from fresh firewood. One by one, more workers arrived through the darkness. A brewer carrying baskets of crushed barley. A boy bringing dates from storage rooms. An older woman with bundles of herbs tied carefully in linen cloth. None arrived with energy or excitement. Their bodies moved with the steady tiredness of people whose labor had no pause. Inside the temple itself, priests were also waking. Some slept in quiet chambers near sacred halls so they could begin purification rituals before dawn. One younger priest named Painasi rose slowly from his mat and sat beside a small basin of water. He washed carefully in silence. Purity mattered deeply before entering the inner temple chambers. The stone floor beneath him felt cool compared to the heat outside. In darkness, he dressed in clean white linen prepared the evening before by temple servants. The cloth smelled faintly of soap made from ash and oils. Nearby, another priest trimmed a lamp wick while reciting soft memorized prayers beneath his breath. The halls around them remained shadowed and still. Painted images covered the walls. Gods with calm faces watched silently from every direction. Blue ceilings decorated with stars disappeared into darkness overhead. Soon the first incense would burn. Soon the first offering tables would fill with bread, fruit, beer, vegetables, roasted duck, flowers, and oil. But before any sacred words could be spoken, hundreds of smaller tasks needed completion. The temple economy was like a living body that never truly slept. Outside the city, farmers already stirred awake beside irrigation canals. The air there smelled wetter than within the crowded town streets. Palm trees shifted gently in the night breeze. Frogs moved through muddy edges near the water. One farmer named Beckett rose from beside his sleeping sons and looked toward the eastern horizon. It was still dark, but he knew time well from years beside the river. Soon boats from nearby villages would begin arriving with fish and vegetables meant for temple kitchens. He tied rough sandals onto tired feet and stepped toward the animal pens. Goats shifted softly as he passed. A cow exhaled heavily into the cool darkness. Every part of the land fed the temples in some way. Fields of grain. Date palms. Onion gardens. Duck ponds. Fishing boats. Bee farms for honey. All moved together within slow daily rhythms tied closely to the river itself. Beckett lifted baskets filled with leeks and cucumbers gathered the evening before. Moisture still clung lightly to their surfaces. Nearby his oldest son rubbed sleep from his eyes and helped secure the baskets onto a wooden sled that would later be pulled toward the town market. The stars above slowly began to fade. Not yet sunrise. Only the first quiet signs that night was loosening its hold. Back within the temple bakery, heat now filled the courtyard. Dough covered Hori's arms to the elbows. Workers pressed loaves into different shapes depending on their purpose. Some were long and flat. Others round and thick. Certain sacred loaves were shaped carefully using carved molds reserved only for ritual use. The ovens glowed orange. Sweat already formed across tired faces, though the day's true heat had not yet arrived. A boy no older than 12 carried wood into the courtyard again and again without complaint. His shoulders were narrow from poor meals and endless labor. Ash covered his feet. He moved quickly because older workers shouted when the fires weakened. Above them, the sky slowly shifted toward gray-blue. The temple kitchens became louder. Clay bowls scraped against stone counters. Water poured from jars. Someone coughed heavily from smoke. Donkeys outside brayed impatiently as new deliveries arrived through the gates. And still the town itself remained mostly asleep. In one quiet home near the river, a woman named Tiaa prepared flowers for the morning offering tables. Her fingers moved gently through lotus blossoms floating inside a shallow basin of water. The petals were pale beneath lamplight. Her daughter slept nearby beside baskets of reeds. Tiaa worked carefully because damaged flowers could not be placed before the gods. The temple demanded freshness, beauty, and order each morning. Wilted petals or bruised stems would bring angry words from supervisors already exhausted from endless responsibilities. Outside her doorway, the scent of wet river plants drifted through the narrow street. She tied the flowers together using thin strands of woven fiber. Beside the lotus flowers she arranged bundles of papyrus reeds and small garlands made from herbs grown near irrigation canals. The work was delicate and slow. Many people believed temple rituals belonged only to priests. But much of the sacred world rested quietly in the hands of ordinary laborers like Tiaa. Without the gardeners, there would be no flowers. Without the bakers, no bread. Without fishermen, no fresh fish. Without brewers, no beer for offering tables. Without farmers, the temples themselves could not survive. As darkness faded further, sounds slowly spread across the town. Doors opened. Sandals scraped across dusty paths. Roosters called from hidden courtyards. A donkey cart rattled over uneven stone. Thin smoke began rising from cooking fires as families prepared early meals before work. Children stirred awake beside sleeping mats. The ancient town was breathing itself back into motion. At the temple gates, scribes now arrived carrying rolls of papyrus beneath their arms. Their task each morning was to record deliveries entering the temple stores. They counted grain sacks, measured oil jars, and tracked fish brought from the river. One scribe paused beside the gate and stretched his stiff shoulders. He had spent much of the previous day bent over records in dim storage rooms heavy with dust and heat. Already he looked tired. Temple life often appeared grand from a distance, but much of it was endless counting, lifting, cleaning, carrying, repairing, washing, measuring, and waiting. Even the priests themselves lived within strict routines repeated day after day. Inside a shaded chamber, Panacea now prepared incense using small pieces of resin placed carefully into a shallow burner. The smell rose slowly into the cool morning air. Sweet. Dry. Earthy. The scent drifted through dark corridors lined with painted gods and sacred animals. Soon another priest entered carrying folded linen cloths used during the morning ritual. Neither spoke loudly. Their movements remained calm and practiced. Outside the inner halls, servants cleaned offering tables with damp cloths. One older servant rubbed carefully at dried stains left from previous meals placed before the statues. Another polished metal bowls until they reflected lamplight softly. Nothing inside the temple moved quickly. The pace remained steady and measured like the river itself. As the eastern horizon brightened, the first fishing boats reached the shore near the town. The fishermen looked exhausted already. Their skin smelled of river water and wet reeds. Nets dripped onto muddy banks while baskets filled with fish were sorted carefully in the growing light. A young fisherman named Didi rubbed his sore hands while helping unload the catch. Tiny cuts covered his fingers from rough rope and fish scales. He had worked through much of the night beneath the stars. Still, part of the catch belonged to the temple. Workers selected the freshest fish first. These would later appear beside bread and vegetables on sacred offering tables inside the cool temple chambers. Nearby, birds circled above the shore searching for scraps. The river itself moved silently past the waking town, carrying bits of reed and reflected morning light southward through the valley. Now the sky had turned pale gold. Sunrise was close. In the bakery courtyard, the first completed loaves emerged from the ovens. Steam rose into the warm air. The smell of fresh bread spread through the temple complex. Hori wiped sweat from his face with flour-covered hands. Ash clung to his arms. His eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion, but still more dough waited beside the ovens. Temple demand never ended. Workers carried baskets of finished bread toward the inner storage halls where scribes counted each delivery carefully. Nothing escaped recording. Every loaf. Every jar. Every flower. Every bird. The temple consumed enormous amounts of food each day, not only for rituals but for feeding the thousands connected to its operation. In quiet courtyards, servants now arranged morning meals for priests who had already begun hours of preparation before sunrise. Bowls of figs, dates, onions, and bread rested on woven mats beside clay cups filled with beer. Even simple meals required labor from many unseen hands. A girl swept dust from one corridor while light slowly entered through high stone openings above her. Tiny particles floated in the air like gold. The temple walls glowed softly beneath the growing dawn. Soon the sacred statues hidden deep within the sanctuary would receive their morning offerings. Soon chants would echo through cool chambers. Soon incense smoke would rise toward painted ceilings filled with stars. But outside those sacred halls, ordinary life continued its slow endless rhythm. Workers carried water. Farmers entered fields. Women baked bread in household ovens. Children chased goats through dusty streets. Merchants unfolded cloth coverings from market stalls. The ancient world was waking fully now beneath the widening sunlight. And through it all, the preparations for the gods continued carefully, quietly, and without rest. The first sunlight reached the upper edges of the temple walls slowly, like warm water being poured across stone. Shadows still rested inside the narrow streets below, where the morning air remained cooler for a little while longer. The city had fully awakened now, though no one moved with great speed. Ancient mornings unfolded gradually. Even busy places carried a heavy and patient rhythm. Within the temple kitchens, the heat from the ovens had already become difficult to escape. Hori stood near the clay fire pits shaping another line of dough while sweat rolled down the sides of his neck. Smoke drifted upward toward openings in the ceiling. The air smelled thick with grain, ash, damp linen, and burning wood. Beside him, one young helper carried trays of flat loaves balanced carefully against his chest. The boy's arms trembled slightly from the weight. Still, he said nothing. Most workers in the temple learned early not to complain aloud. Labor belonged to daily life the same way the Nile belonged to the land. People grew up expecting tired muscles, dusty skin, aching backs, and long hours beneath the sun. Outside the kitchens, temple servants crossed the courtyards carrying the morning offerings toward the inner halls. Their sandals brushed softly against smooth stone floors worn down by countless footsteps across many generations. Large woven baskets held bread still warm from the ovens. Clay jars carried beer made from barley and dates. Bundles of onions and leeks rested beside figs, cucumbers, lentils, and freshly cut herbs. One servant balanced a tray of roasted duck covered with linen cloth. Another carried lotus flowers floating inside shallow bowls of water so the petals would remain fresh. The work required care. Nothing could be dropped. Nothing could arrive late. As the sun climbed higher, golden light entered the outer courtyards and painted long shapes across the stone ground. Pigeons fluttered along the temple roof searching for crumbs near the kitchens. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brayed loudly before being silenced by its owner. Inside the sacred sanctuary, however, the world remained cool and dim. Painasi stepped carefully through the shadowed chamber holding a smoking incense burner before him. The scent curled slowly upward through narrow beams of light entering from high stone openings above. The painted walls around him glowed faintly in reds, blues, and golds. The silence inside these rooms felt different from the silence outside. It was deeper. Heavier. Even the footsteps seemed softer here. Behind him, two younger priests carried folded white linen and trays of prepared offerings. Their heads were lowered respectfully as they entered the chamber where the sacred statue rested hidden within its shrine. Every morning followed nearly the same order. Doors were opened. Prayers were spoken. Incense was lifted. Food was presented. Fresh cloth was offered. Oil was poured carefully into lamps. The gods, it was believed, needed attention just as living rulers did. The temple rituals were acts of care repeated day after day across the years. And though the statues themselves remained still and silent, the labor surrounding them never paused. Outside the sanctuary, scribes sat cross-legged beside low tables recording deliveries arriving from nearby farms and workshops. Papyrus rolls spread across their laps while thin reed brushes scratched softly against ink palettes. One older scribe paused to stretch his fingers. Already the day felt long. The storage rooms around him were crowded with goods gathered from fields, riverboats, gardens, and markets. Clay jars lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Grain sacks rested in neat rows beneath hanging dust. Workers passed constantly through the narrow aisles carrying baskets on shoulders hardened by years of labor. The smell inside the storage halls was thick and warm. Grain dust floated through sunlight. Dried herbs hung from beams overhead. The faint sweetness of dates mixed with oil and damp clay. Near the rear wall, a worker struggled to move a heavy jar filled with beer intended for later rituals. His breathing became rough as he leaned his shoulder against the clay surface. Another man eventually stepped beside him to help. Together they pushed the jar slowly across the floor without speaking. Many temple workers were poor. Their homes were small. Their meals were simple. Some owned little beyond rough clothing, sleeping mats, a few jars, and small wooden stools. Yet much of their labor supported the great temple system that towered above the town like a second world inside the first. Not all workers lived within the city itself. Across the Nile, in smaller farming villages surrounded by green fields and irrigation canals, families had already spent hours gathering produce for delivery. Under the growing heat of morning, farmers bent low beside vegetable gardens pulling onions from dark soil dampened by river water. A young woman named Merit worked beside her mother near a narrow canal lined with reeds. Mud pressed between her toes while dragonflies moved across the water nearby. Together they gathered bundles of lettuce and herbs meant for the temple kitchens. The sun was still low, but already the warmth settled heavily across the fields. Merit wiped sweat from her forehead with the edge of her linen shawl. Nearby, her younger brother guided a small donkey pulling baskets toward the loading area near the riverbank. From here the temple walls looked distant and pale against the brightening sky. Yet the family's work remained tied to those walls every single day. Taxes, offerings, deliveries, labor obligations, and seasonal demands connected ordinary people closely to the temples whether they ever entered the sacred halls or not. The Nile itself carried much of this movement. Boats drifted steadily along its surface carrying grain, fish, stone, reeds, pottery, cloth, and animals between towns and temples. Along the riverbanks, fishermen repaired torn nets beneath clusters of palm trees while children played nearby in the wet mud. The river smelled of water plants, fish scales, damp earth, and warm sunlight. Its slow movement shaped nearly every hour of life. By mid-morning, the streets near the temple market had become crowded. Merchants spread woven mats beneath shaded awnings while buyers moved carefully between them. The sound of bargaining rose softly through the heat. Clay cups knocked together. Goats pulled against ropes tied near stalls. Somewhere a baby cried while its mother purchased onions and bread. Dust lifted constantly beneath moving feet. A merchant arranged jars of honey beside baskets of dried figs. Nearby, another man sold sandals woven from papyrus reeds. Thin strips of dyed cloth flutter gently in the warm breeze between market poles. Temple workers often passed through the market during breaks in labor. Some purchased extra food for their families before returning to kitchens, storerooms, workshops, or gardens. Others simply rested for a few moments beneath shade whenever possible. Shade mattered deeply in Egypt. As the sun climbed higher overhead, stone walls reflected heat back into the streets. The brightness became difficult to escape. Workers wrapped linen around their heads. Animals searched for cooler places beside buildings. Even conversations seemed slower beneath the heavy afternoon air. Near one outer courtyard wall, several laborers rested beside stacked baskets waiting for transport. One man removed his sandals and rubbed sore feet covered in dust. Another leaned against the warm stone with eyes closed for a few quiet moments before work resumed. Their hands were rough. Their shoulders bent from years of carrying loads. Most would continue similar routines until old age or illness made labor impossible. Yet within the temple system, even small tasks held importance. A gardener trimming flowers. A brewer sealing jars. A cleaner sweeping corridors. A fisherman gutting fish beside the river. Every action became part of the larger daily rhythm surrounding the gods and the temple itself. Back inside the sacred chambers, the morning offering ritual had nearly finished. Panasi stood before the offering table while faint incense smoke drifted through the room. Bread rested beside bowls of fruit and beer arranged carefully in ordered rows. Lotus flowers floated in shallow dishes. Oil lamps flickered softly against painted walls. The chamber remained cool despite the growing heat outside. He spoke the final prayers quietly. Then, slowly, the priests began removing certain offerings to be redistributed later among temple workers and staff. Food placed before the gods did not simply disappear. Much of it eventually returned into the daily life of the temple community. Nothing was wasted if it could still be eaten. Outside the sanctuary, servants carried trays away through dim corridors while scribes updated records nearby. Already preparations for later meals and future rituals had begun. The cycle never paused. In another section of the temple complex, craftsmen worked in long shaded workshops repairing furniture, carving wooden boxes, painting ritual objects, and shaping new pottery. The tapping of tools echoed softly beneath covered roofs. One elderly artisan sat cross-legged beside a wooden statue in need of repair. His eyesight had weakened over the years, forcing him to lean close while smoothing rough surfaces with careful hands. Dust clung to his arms. Small curls of wood collected beside his feet. Near him, younger workers mixed pigments inside shallow bowls using crushed minerals gathered from distant regions. Red, blue, green, yellow, and black powders stained their fingers while they prepared paints for temple decorations and ritual objects. The workshop smelled of wood shavings, hot clay, oil, and sweat. Outside, the streets shimmered beneath midday sunlight now. Children chased one another through narrow alleys while older women sat weaving baskets beside shaded doorways. Dogs slept beneath carts. Palm leaves rattled gently in the dry breeze. In homes throughout the town, families prepared simple midday meals. Bread, beer, onions, lentils, sometimes fish, sometimes dates or figs if available. Many meals were eaten quietly because workers remained tired from the long hours beginning before dawn. Some families rested indoors where walls blocked part of the heat. Others sat beneath fabric coverings stretched between rooftops for shade. Even resting required patience during the hottest hours. The air itself felt heavy. In one small home near the temple district, TIAA finished sorting fresh flowers delivered from nearby gardens. Many blossoms had already wilted slightly beneath the sun. She dipped their stems again into cool water jars while her daughter crushed fragrant herbs nearby for temple perfumes and oils. The room smelled sweet and earthy. Light entered softly through a narrow doorway, illuminating floating dust in the warm air. TIAA's hands moved slowly now from fatigue. She had risen long before dawn to begin preparing lotus flowers for the morning rituals. Yet more work still waited before nightfall. Temple life depended upon endless repetition. Flowers each morning. Fresh bread each dawn. Clean cloth. Filled oil lamps. Swept floors. Recorded grain. Washed bowls. The sacred routines continued because ordinary people continued working. Beyond the city walls, fields stretched green beside the shining Nile. Farmers bent low among crops while birds circled overhead in the bright afternoon sky. Water wheels creaked beside canals. Oxen pulled slowly through muddy irrigation paths. The smell of wet earth rose beneath the heat. A farmer paused briefly beside the canal and looked toward the distant temple towers rising above the town. Their pale stone surfaces glowed brightly beneath the sun. From far away, the temples appeared calm and eternal. But inside them, countless tired hands remained busy every hour of the day. And as the afternoon slowly deepened toward evening, preparations would soon begin again for another dawn yet to come. By late afternoon, the sunlight softened slightly across the Nile Valley, though the heat still rested heavily on the land. The brightest part of the day had passed, yet warmth continued to rise from stone walls, dusty roads, and flat rooftops where the sun had lingered for many long hours. Inside the temple complex, workers moved more slowly now. The morning rush had ended, but labor never truly disappeared. The kitchen still baked bread for the evening meal. Scribes still counted supplies in shadowed storage halls. Servants still swept dust from corridors where sandals carried dirt in from the streets. The smell of baked grain drifted through the warm air once again. Hori sat briefly beside the bakery wall, resting on an overturned basket while another batch of loaves baked nearby. His arms felt heavy. Fine flour covered the lines in his hands and settled into the folds of his clothing. A clay cup of watered beer rested beside him on the ground. He drank slowly. Around him, younger workers continued kneading dough beneath the orange glow of the ovens. One boy yawned quietly while stacking fresh firewood near the wall. Another brushed ash away from the baking stones with a bundle of reeds. No one spoke much. By this hour of day, conversation often faded into silence. The body itself became tired enough that words no longer seemed important. Outside the kitchens, long shadows stretched across the temple courtyards. Pigeons gathered near scattered crumbs along the edges of the stone paths. The cries of merchants from the nearby market had grown softer as people slowly packed away goods before evening. The entire town seemed to loosen its grip on the day little by little. Near the riverbank, fishermen repaired torn nets while sitting beneath the shade of palm trees. The Nile moved beside them in slow shining patterns beneath the lowering sun. Small insects drifted above the water. Reeds rustled gently whenever the breeze passed through. One fisherman named Didu sat with his legs stretched toward the mud while his fingers worked carefully through broken netting. His shoulders ached from the night before. The river demanded patience and strength from everyone who depended on it. Nets became tangled. Boats cracked beneath heat and water. Fish spoiled quickly under the sun if not cleaned at once. Yet each night the fishermen returned again to the dark water before dawn. Nearby, a small group of children played beside the shore while an older woman washed linen cloth in the shallows. She beat the wet fabric against smooth stone slowly and steadily. Water splashed around her ankles. The smell here was different from the crowded town. Cool mud. Wet reeds. Fish. River plants warming beneath the fading sun. Along the western bank, fields stretched quietly into the distance. Farmers gathered tools and animals before darkness arrived. Oxen moved slowly through dusty paths, birds crossed overhead in thin dark lines against the pale evening sky. A farmer named Beckett lifted baskets of leftover vegetables onto a wooden sled while his youngest son chased goats toward their enclosure. The boy stumbled once in the soft dirt but quickly stood again, brushing dust from his knees. Beckett watched the sky carefully. Soon the temperature would ease enough for people to breathe more comfortably again. Evening mattered deeply in Egypt. After the harsh brightness of midday, the cooler hours brought relief that spread gently through the land. Families emerged from shaded interiors. Workers rested beside doorways. Rooftops filled slowly with people seeking air after the long heat. In the town streets, cooking fires began appearing one by one. Thin smoke drifted upward into the evening light. Women prepared lentils in clay pots. Flat bread warmed over small ovens. Dates and onions were arranged onto simple reed mats for the night meal. The smells of smoke, grain, and roasted vegetables floated through narrow alleys. A donkey cart rattled slowly across uneven stones near the market district. The driver looked exhausted. His face shone with sweat and dust beneath the fading sunlight. Nearby, merchants folded cloth coverings over unsold goods while speaking quietly among themselves. Clay jars were stacked carefully for the night. Baskets of figs and herbs disappeared into storage rooms. The market that had felt crowded and noisy hours earlier now settled into calmness. Within the temple walls, evening rituals had begun replacing the morning routines. Priests moved through dim halls carrying oil lamps as daylight slowly disappeared from the upper chambers. Shadows deepened along painted walls where images of gods watched silently beneath flickering firelight. Panacea stood near one inner corridor trimming lamp wicks with careful fingers. The scent of incense still lingered faintly in the air from earlier ceremonies. The temple felt different at night. Cooler. Quieter. More distant from the crowded world outside. Servants moved through the halls collecting used offering trays from earlier rituals. Some bowls still held fruit and bread that would later be shared among workers. Others carried empty jars smelling faintly of beer and oil. Nothing inside the temple remained still for long. Even after sunset, cleaners swept floors, guards watched gates, and scribes finished records by lamplight. One elderly cleaner worked alone through a side corridor carrying a clay lamp in one hand and a bundle of reeds in the other. Her feet moved slowly across the stone floor worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Dust gathered everywhere in Egypt. Wind carried it through open courtyards, under doorways, across rooftops, and into sacred chambers. Cleaning never truly ended. Farther inside the temple complex, workers closed storage rooms for the night. Heavy wooden doors creaked shut while scribes checked seals made from clay pressed with official markings. A young scribe rubbed tired eyes as he finished the final grain count of the day. Papyrus sheets covered the low table before him. His back hurt from hours spent bending forward in dim rooms heavy with heat and dust. Outside, the last sunlight faded from the tops of the temple columns. The sky turned deep gold, then orange, then slowly blue again. Along the Nile, evening boats drifted quietly across darkening water. Oars moved with soft splashes. Voices carried faintly through the cooling air. Palm trees became silhouettes against the western horizon where the sun disappeared behind distant desert hills. As darkness approached, many workers finally returned home. Hori walked slowly through the narrow streets carrying a small cloth bundle containing leftover bread from the temple kitchens. His feet felt sore beneath worn sandals. Every muscle in his body seemed heavier than it had at sunrise. Still, the evening air felt pleasant against his skin after the ovens. Children ran past him laughing softly before disappearing into nearby alleys. From open doorways came the sound of families speaking over their meals. Somewhere a flute played quietly for a few moments before stopping again. The town no longer smelled only of dust and heat. Now there was bread, smoke, cooking lentils, oil lamps, cooling stone after sunset. At home, Hori's wife sat beside a small clay stove stirring a pot slowly while their children rested nearby. The room glowed softly beneath one flickering lamp set into the wall. He entered quietly and lowered himself onto the woven mat with visible exhaustion. No grand words were exchanged. Most evenings ended this way. Simple food. Tired bodies. Silence settling naturally after long labor. Outside their home, neighbors climbed ladders toward flat rooftops where many families slept during warmer months. Blankets were spread carefully across the mud brick surfaces. Clay water jars were carried upward before night fully arrived. Above the town, stars slowly returned. The sky over Egypt often appeared enormous after dark. Clear. Deep. Filled with cold white light above the warm earth below. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared once more for the night's work. Didu checked his repaired net carefully while another man untied a small wooden boat from its post. The Nile reflected broken pieces of moonlight across its slow-moving surface. Night fishing could be peaceful in certain moments. The air cooled. The birds quieted. The river became softer somehow beneath darkness. yet the labor remained difficult all the same. Nearby, insects hummed among the reeds while frogs called steadily from the muddy edges of the shore. Farther away, temple guards lit additional lamps near the outer gates as darkness deepened across the city. Inside the sacred halls, priests prepared the final rituals before rest. Panasi carried a lamp through the sanctuary one last time before certain doors would remain closed until morning. The painted walls flickered beside him in orange light. The smell of old stone, oil smoke, and incense surrounded the chamber. The sacred statue rested silently within shadow. Outside those quiet walls, countless workers already slept or prepared for another dawn of labor. Bakers, farmers, flower gatherers, boatmen, servants, sweepers, brewers, scribes, all tied together by routines repeated day after day beside the Nile River. And even now, as the night deepened over the ancient town, tomorrow's offerings had already begun in small unseen ways. Grain soaking in water, flowers resting in cool basins, fishing boats entering darkness, wood stacked beside ovens, oil jars waiting in storerooms. The next morning was slowly approaching long before the people themselves could rest completely. Across the rooftops, families lay beneath the stars while warm wind drifted through the town. Some listened quietly to distant river sounds before sleep arrived. Others watched oil lamps flickering across nearby homes until their eyes grew heavy. The temple walls stood silent above them all. And somewhere within those shadowed courtyards, one young worker was already awake again, carrying firewood toward the ovens before dawn returned once more to ancient Egypt. The hours before dawn were often the quietest moments in the ancient town. The heat of the previous day had finally faded from the streets, and the air carried a softness that would not last long after sunrise. Most rooftops remained still beneath the stars. Families slept close together under thin linen cloths while the faint breeze moved gently across mud brick walls and narrow alleys below. From far away came the slow sound of water touching the riverbank. The Nile never truly became silent. Even in darkness, small waves brushed against reeds and boats tied along the shore. Insects hummed softly near the canals. Somewhere beyond the sleeping houses, a dog barked once and then fell quiet again. Above the town, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky. Some people were still awake beneath them. Near the temple bakery, the young worker carrying firewood moved carefully through the dark courtyard with another heavy bundle balanced across his shoulders. His name was Nebu, and though he was still very young, his mornings began earlier than most. Ash clung to his arms and feet. The courtyard smelled faintly of smoke from fires that had never completely gone out. A low orange glow still rested inside the ovens from the previous evening. Nebu dropped the wood beside the clay fire pits and rubbed his tired eyes. He had slept only a few hours. Most temple workers rested little during busy seasons when deliveries arrived constantly from nearby villages and farms. There was always grain to grind, floors to sweep, water to carry, or fires to feed. Nebu knelt beside the ovens and pushed fresh wood carefully into the embers. Small flames slowly returned to life. The crackling sound echoed softly against the surrounding walls. Soon the bakery would fill again with workers and heat and smoke. But for a few moments longer, the temple complex remained peaceful beneath the darkness. In another part of the town, Tiaa awoke before the stars had faded. Her daughter still slept beside the flower baskets, curled beneath a thin blanket. The room smelled faintly of lotus petals and damp reeds resting inside clay basins. Tiaa sat quietly for a moment before standing. Her knees ached from the previous day. Years spent sitting beside baskets and bending over flowers had slowly stiffened her joints. Still, the temple would need fresh garlands again before sunrise. She lit a small oil lamp and began checking the blossoms gathered the evening before. Some petals had already started curling slightly at the edges. Those would be separated from the freshest flowers and used elsewhere. Nothing useful was thrown away easily. Even wilted blossoms could still provide fragrance for oils or decoration for smaller shrines. Outside her doorway, the alley remained dark and cool. A thin layer of dust covered the ground untouched by footsteps since nightfall. Far above, one faint pale line had begun appearing low in the eastern sky. Morning was returning. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared their boats beneath dim starlight. Didu tightened rope around a bundle of nets while another man checked a small oil lamp hanging from the front of the boat. Their movements were slow from exhaustion. The river smelled cool at this hour. Wet mud. Fish. Water plants drifting gently along the shore. Mist floated lightly above parts of the Nile where colder air met the warmer water. Reeds swayed softly against the banks while insects moved through the darkness nearby. The fishermen pushed their boat into the river without speaking much. Wood scraped quietly against mud before the current carried them outward. Soon their small shape disappeared into the dark water. Back inside the temple complex, more workers now arrived through the outer gates. A brewer carrying sacks of barley. A servant balancing empty water jars. Two boys dragging baskets filled with onions and leeks. The guards at the entrance looked sleepy beneath the fading stars. One leaned heavily against his spear while watching the workers pass through. Temple life began long before the sun appeared. Inside the kitchens, Hori entered the courtyard with slow, tired steps. His body still felt heavy from the previous day's labor. The smell of smoke greeted him immediately as he approached the ovens where Nebu had already rebuilt the fires. The young boy nodded respectfully. Hori rested one hand briefly against the warm clay surface of the oven. Heat was returning quickly now. Nearby, another worker began grinding grain using a heavy stone tool that scraped rhythmically through the quiet air. The sound was ancient and familiar. Stone against grain. Again and again. Across countless mornings. Soon water was poured into mixing bowls. Dough was pressed by rough hands. Ash floated through the warm air as the bakery slowly came alive once more. Beyond the kitchen walls, temple servants swept the outer courtyards before sunrise. Their reed brooms moved gently across the stone floors, gathering dust into small piles. In the darkness, the painted columns looked pale and ghost-like beneath the oil lamps. One servant paused to stretch his sore back while another filled lamps with fresh oil from narrow clay jars. The temple had to appear clean and ordered before the first rituals began. Purity mattered deeply. Dust was constant in Egypt, yet every morning workers fought against it once again. Farther inside the sacred halls, Painasi washed himself carefully beside a stone basin filled with cool water. The chill against his skin helped wake him fully after the short night's sleep. Nearby, another priest prepared clean linen garments folded neatly upon a low wooden table. The room smelled of oil, soap, and faint incense lingering from the evening before. No loud voices entered these chambers. Even ordinary movements felt restrained and quiet. Painasi dressed slowly in white linen while listening to the distant sounds beginning to rise from the temple grounds outside. The bakery fires. Footsteps in corridors. Water splashing into jars. The soft creak of wooden doors opening. Morning labor was spreading through the complex like light slowly moving across the land. Outside the town, farmers also stirred awake beside canals and animal pens. The darkness there felt wider beneath the open sky. Palm trees rustled softly above sleeping goats and cattle. Beckett sat upright beside his sons and looked toward the eastern horizon where pale silver light now touched the edges of the fields. Soon the birds would begin calling. Soon the heat would return. For now, the world remained cool enough to breathe comfortably. Beckett walked toward the irrigation canal carrying 2 empty water jars balanced across a wooden pole resting on his shoulders. Mud pressed softly beneath his sandals while frogs leaped into the water at his approach. The canal reflected the first dim signs of dawn. Nearby, another farmer already guided oxen slowly toward the fields. Their breathing rose visibly into the cool air. All across the Nile Valley, people were waking together within the same quiet rhythm. Some rose for the fields. Some for fishing. Some for baking. Some for carrying offerings into the sacred halls. As the eastern sky brightened further, birds began moving through the palm trees near the river. Their calls spread gently across the landscape. A faint golden color slowly replaced the gray-blue darkness over the horizon. Inside the bakery courtyard, the ovens now glowed brightly. Heat pressed heavily against the workers' faces. Dough covered the wooden preparation tables. Nebu hurried between stacks of firewood while older bakers shaped loaves with practiced hands. Sweat had already begun forming despite the early hour. Hori pressed another round loaf into a clay mold reserved for temple offerings. The carved patterns would leave sacred symbols across the surface once baked. Nearby, fresh beer jars arrived from the brewing rooms where workers had spent much of the night preparing thick barley mixtures for the coming day. The smell inside the kitchens grew richer now. Warm grain. Yeast. Smoke. Wet clay. Boiling porridge. Outside, the first true sunlight touched the tops of the temple walls. A golden line spread slowly downward across the stone columns and painted reliefs. Shadows shifted across the courtyards as dawn finally arrived. Temple servants moved more quickly now. The morning rituals approached. Baskets filled with bread were carried toward inner storage halls. Fresh flowers arrived beside bowls of figs and dates. Clay cups were polished. Offering tables were wiped clean once more. Scribes entered the complex carrying papyrus rolls beneath their arms, already preparing for another long day of counting deliveries and recording supplies. One elderly scribe yawned heavily before sitting beside his low writing table. His fingers were stained dark from years of ink. Near the outer gates, villagers arrived leading donkeys loaded with vegetables, fish, and grain collected from nearby settlements. Dust rose beneath the animals' feet while guards checked deliveries entering the temple grounds. The town itself awakened rapidly now. Smoke lifted from rooftop ovens. Children cried softly from within homes. Women carried water jars through the alleys. Merchants opened wooden shutters facing the market streets. The ancient world returned once more to motion beneath the growing sunlight. And deep inside the temple sanctuary, Panasi lifted incense into the cool dim chamber while the first offerings of the new day were placed carefully before the silent gods. The morning sunlight spread slowly through the city, touching rooftops, courtyards, and narrow streets one piece at a time. Warm light rested against the pale temple walls while long shadows still lingered in the cooler alleys below. The day had fully begun now, and with it came the steady movement of thousands of small tasks woven together across the ancient town. Inside the temple grounds, the rhythm of labor deepened. Servants crossed open courtyards carrying trays balanced carefully against their shoulders. Bakers lifted fresh bread from smoking ovens. Scribes bent over papyrus records while workers moved endlessly through storage halls lined with grain sacks and oil jars. The sound of footsteps echoed softly against stone. Near the inner sanctuary, Panasi stood quietly beside the offering table while thin streams of incense smoke drifted upward through the dim chamber. Oil lamps flicker gently against painted walls where blue stars and sacred figures glowed faintly in the low light. The morning rituals unfolded slowly and carefully. Nothing was rushed. One younger priest unfolded fresh linen cloth with both hands and placed it neatly before the sacred statue. Another arranged bread and fruit into ordered rows while softly speaking memorized prayers beneath his breath. Outside these quiet chambers, ordinary labor continued without pause. Hori wiped sweat from his forehead as another wave of heat rolled from the ovens. The bakery courtyard already felt hotter than the streets beyond the walls. Ash floated through the air in pale gray clouds whenever fresh wood was pushed into the fires. Nebu hurried past carrying a basket filled with small loaves meant for temple workers. His arms strained beneath the weight. The boy moved quickly because delays brought angry voices from supervisors whose own exhaustion often made patience difficult. Yet even the harshest workers softened slightly during these early hours before the full midday heat arrived. For a brief time each morning, the city still carried traces of coolness from the night before. In the streets outside the temple district, merchants arranged goods beneath woven coverings stretched between wooden poles. Dust rose gently around their feet as the market slowly filled again with voices and movement. A woman carrying clay jars paused beside a vegetable stall while her small child clung sleepily to her linen clothing. Nearby, a man stacked onions into neat rows while calling softly to passing buyers. The smells of the market mixed together in the warming air. Fresh bread, fish, dust, animal sweat, dates warming beneath the sun, smoke drifting from nearby cooking fires. A donkey cart rolled slowly over uneven stones carrying baskets of cucumbers gathered earlier beside the canals. The animals' hooves struck the road with slow hollow sounds while flies circled lazily through the growing heat. Along the outer edges of the city, farmers worked steadily beneath the brightening sky. The Nile shimmered nearby between green reeds and muddy banks where water birds searched for fish in the shallows. Beckett guided his oxen carefully along the edge of an irrigation canal while his sons gathered weeds from the vegetable rows nearby. The damp soil clung heavily to their feet. Sweat already darkened the backs of their linen garments. The land beside the Nile required endless attention. Canals had to remain clear. Animals needed water. Fields demanded constant care beneath the harsh sun. Yet these same fields fed the temples, the markets, and the homes scattered across the valley. Farther along the riverbank, fishermen returned from the night's work. Didu and the others pulled wet nets onto shore while morning light reflected brightly across the water behind them. Their catch was smaller than they had hoped. Several fish had escaped through damaged netting before dawn. Still, enough remained to sell part in the market and send part toward the temple kitchens. Didu's hands were raw from rope and water. Tiny cuts crossed his fingers and palms. He sat briefly beside the boat while another fisherman sorted fish into woven baskets lined with damp reeds. Nearby, birds circled overhead waiting for scraps. The fishermen spoke quietly among themselves, their voices slow from exhaustion. Most had worked through the entire night beneath the open sky. Soon they would sleep for a few hours before beginning repairs on nets and boats once more. Life beside the Nile rarely allowed complete rest. Back inside the temple complex, servants carried fresh flowers through the corridors toward the sacred chambers. Tiaa walked carefully beside her daughter while balancing a shallow basket filled with lotus blossoms floating in cool water. The petals glowed softly beneath the filtered sunlight entering through high stone openings. The temple hall smelled faintly of incense and polished oil lamps. As Tiaa passed one painted wall, she slowed for a moment to adjust a flower stem that had bent during the walk. Her fingers moved gently and precisely. Years of work had taught her how delicate the blossoms could become beneath heat and dryness. Many temple workers believed flowers carried a quiet kind of peace into the sacred rooms. Their colors softened the heavy stone interiors. Their scent mixed with incense and oils. Even during long days of labor, the presence of fresh flowers seemed to calm the atmosphere slightly. Tiaa continued deeper into the temple while servants stepped aside to let her pass. Far above, pigeons gathered along the tops of the outer columns where sunlight now burned brightly against the stone. The coolness of dawn had almost vanished completely. By mid-morning, heat spread through every open space. In shaded workshops attached to the temple, craftsmen worked beside open doorways to catch whatever breeze still moved through the complex. One man carved wooden handles for ceremonial tools while another shaped wet clay into bowls that would later dry beneath the sun. The workshop smelled of damp earth, sawdust, oil, and sweat. A young apprentice carried water jars from room to room so workers could continue through the rising heat. The jars grew warm quickly despite being filled only moments earlier. Near the back wall, an elderly painter carefully repaired faded colors on a wooden offering chest. His hands trembled slightly with age as he dipped a thin brush into crushed mineral pigment. Blue, red, gold, green. The same colors had covered temple walls and sacred objects for generations beyond memory. Outside the workshops, guards stood watch beside the gates with tired expressions beneath the sunlight. Their spears rested against their shoulders while travelers and merchants entered the temple district carrying goods for delivery. One guard shifted uncomfortably beneath the growing heat and glanced toward the shaded side of the wall where a small patch of darkness still remained. Shade became precious as the day advanced. Even animals searched for cooler places. Dogs slept beneath carts. Goats pressed close against mud brick walls. Birds hid among palm leaves beside the canals. Inside family homes throughout the town, women prepared the second meals of the day while small children played nearby in the dusty courtyards. Lentils simmered slowly in clay pots. Flatbread cooled on woven mats. Water jars wrapped in damp cloth stood near doorways to keep them cooler for a little longer. Many homes were simple. One room. A storage corner. A cooking space. A ladder leading toward the roof. Yet even within these small spaces, life carried its own steady routines. A mother washing clothing beside a basin. An old man mending sandals. A child grinding grain with both hands. The ancient world moved forward through these ordinary moments more than through grand ceremonies or royal processions. And still, above it all, the temples remained at the center of daily life. Near noon, the sunlight became almost white against the stone courtyards. Workers crossed open spaces more quickly now, seeking shadows wherever possible. The air shimmered faintly above the ground. Inside the bakery, the ovens roared with unbearable heat. Hori's face glistened with sweat while he pressed more dough into shape. Nebu stumbled briefly from exhaustion while carrying wood but quickly regained balance before anyone shouted. The fires demanded constant feeding. Bread for the priests. Bread for workers. Bread for offerings. Bread for storage. Always more bread. The smell of baked grain filled the courtyard so heavily that it clung to clothing and skin long after workers returned home at night. Nearby, brewers stirred thick barley mixtures inside enormous clay vats using wooden paddles taller than their shoulders. The room smelled sour and warm. Flies gathered constantly around spilled grain near the floor. One brewer wiped his forehead with a cloth already soaked from sweat. His arms moved slowly from fatigue. Still the paddles continued turning through the heavy liquid. Elsewhere in the temple grounds, scribes recorded the morning's final deliveries while servants distributed portions of food from earlier offerings among workers and staff. Bowls of bread, onions, fish, and beer passed through tired hands beneath the midday heat. For many laborers, these temple meals formed an important part of survival. The work was exhausting. But food connected to the temple system often kept families alive during difficult seasons. As the sun climbed toward its highest point, the city seemed to slow beneath the weight of heat and brightness. Voices softened. Movements became heavier. Even the Nile itself appeared calmer beneath the burning sky. And inside the cool shadowed sanctuary, incense still drifted gently upward before the silent gods, while outside, countless ordinary workers continued the endless labor that kept the sacred world alive day after day beside the river. By the middle of the day, the heat settled over the Nile Valley like a heavy blanket. The sunlight above the temple courtyards had become so bright that many workers narrowed their eyes while crossing open spaces. Stone floors reflected warmth upward through worn sandals. Dust clung to damp skin. Even the wind moving through the streets felt dry and tired now. The city slowed beneath the weight of the afternoon. In the market district, woven shade coverings fluttered softly above the stalls while merchants rested on low stools behind their goods. Buyers moved more quietly than they had during the cooler morning hours. Conversations became slower. Small pauses stretched between words. A seller of figs leaned back against a mud brick wall and closed his eyes briefly while flies circled lazily around baskets beside him. Nearby, a woman poured water carefully over vegetables to keep them from drying too quickly beneath the heat. The smell of the market had deepened. Warm fruit. Animal sweat. Dust. Hot stone. Fish beginning to dry beneath the sun. Along one narrow alley, a young boy carried a clay water jar nearly as large as his chest. His steps were careful and uneven. Water slipped over the rim occasionally, darkening the dusty ground beneath his feet. Every task felt heavier during the hottest hours. Inside the temple bakery, the heat from the ovens mixed with the burning air from outside until breathing itself became difficult. Hori's linen clothing clung to his body with sweat while he lifted another tray of bread from the fire. The skin on his forearms had darkened over many years beside the ovens. Ash covered his feet. Nebu sat briefly against the wall near the woodpile, rubbing his eyes with flour-covered fingers. His shoulders rose and fell slowly with exhaustion. He had already carried countless bundles of wood since before dawn. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Only the sounds of labor filled the courtyard. The crackling fire. Dough pressed against wooden tables. Clay bowls scraping stone. Heavy breathing in the heat. Beyond the kitchens, the temple halls remained cooler, though the warmth still reached even the shadowed corridors by afternoon. Servants moved quietly through the dim passageways carrying fresh water for priests and workers. Painasi sat near a narrow opening high in the wall where a faint current of air entered the chamber. A papyrus scroll rested open across his lap, though his eyes drifted often toward the distant sunlight outside. Even within the sacred halls, the body felt the heaviness of the day. An older priest nearby slowly fanned himself with woven reeds while another trimmed dying lamp wicks beside the offering tables. The scent of incense lingered softly in the still air. The temple sanctuary seemed untouched by time in moments like these. Cool stone. Low firelight. Painted gods watching silently from the walls. Yet beyond those chambers, ordinary life continued under the burning sun. Along the riverbank, fishermen repaired boats beneath whatever shade they could find. Didu sat beside an overturned wooden boat with a small knife in hand, scraping damaged wood carefully near one cracked edge. Sweat rolled down his neck onto the dry earth below. Nearby, another fisherman untangled knots from a net spread across the ground like woven gray cloth. Tiny silver fish scales still clung to parts of the rope and glittered faintly beneath the sunlight. The river itself moved slowly and brightly behind them. Birds stood motionless near the reeds at the edge of the water. Palm trees bent gently in the warm breeze. The muddy banks smelled rich beneath the heat. Didu paused his work for a moment and walked toward the Nile to rinse his hands. The water felt cool against his skin. For a few quiet seconds, he simply stood there watching sunlight move across the surface of the river. Then he returned to work. There was always more work. Farther from the city, the farming villages had grown quiet during the afternoon heat. Many laborers rested briefly indoors while the sun stood high above the fields. Inside one mud brick home, Becket's wife sat grinding grain beside the doorway where a small amount of moving air reached the room. Her daughter slept nearby on a woven mat while flies buzzed softly against the walls. The grain stone moved in slow circles beneath tired hands. Back and forth. Again and again. The sound blended with distant goat calls and the faint rustling of palm leaves outside. A pot of lentils simmered gently near the cooking fire while sunlight entered through the doorway in a narrow golden line across the floor. Life in these homes followed familiar rhythms shaped by heat, river water, seasons, and labor. People rested when they could, worked when necessary, and endured the long difficult afternoons together. Outside, the fields shimmered beneath the brightness. Canals reflected white sunlight. Oxen stood beneath shade trees flicking their tails lazily against flies. The entire valley seemed to breathe more slowly. Back at the temple, the storage halls remained busy despite the heat. Workers carried grain sacks through narrow aisles lined with jars of oil, beer, dried fish, and honey. The air inside the storerooms was thick and dusty. An elderly scribe sat beside a low table recording inventory marks onto papyrus while wiping sweat from his forehead with a linen cloth. His fingers moved carefully despite fatigue. Every sack mattered. Every jar counted. The temple relied on order. Without records, confusion could spread quickly through the endless movement of supplies entering and leaving the complex each day. Nearby, two laborers struggled to lift a heavy beer jar onto a wooden platform. Their muscles strained beneath the weight while clay scraped softly against stone. One man let out a long tired breath after the jar was finally secured. The afternoon stretched onward. In shaded workshops, craftsmen continued their quiet labor. The old painter repairing temple objects leaned close to his work while sweat gathered along his brow. Tiny brushes moved slowly across faded carvings. Beside him, an apprentice mixed crushed minerals into fresh paint powders. Blue dust stained his fingertips darkly. The workshop smelled of oil, wood, and hot clay. Outside the doorway, sunlight blazed against the courtyard stones so brightly that the edges of objects appeared to shimmer. Somewhere deeper within the temple, a servant swept corridors where footprints had gathered in thin layers of dust throughout the day. The broom moved rhythmically across the smooth floor while distant voices echoed faintly through the halls. By late afternoon, the worst of the heat began to soften slightly. Not much. Only enough for workers to notice the smallest relief in the moving air. The shadows lengthened across the courtyards once more. Pigeons returned to the tops of the columns. The market slowly regained a little energy as people emerged again from shaded interiors. Merchants rearranged goods. Children wandered through the alleys. Water sellers crossed the streets balancing jars against their shoulders. Near the bakery, Hori finally stepped outside the ovens for a short moment and stood beside the courtyard wall where faint shade had returned. His entire body ached. He watched temple servants crossing the open space carrying evening supplies toward the kitchens. Fresh vegetables. Water jars. Bundles of herbs. Soon preparations would begin for the night meals. Soon lamps would be lit. Soon rooftops would fill again with resting families beneath the stars. The cycle repeated endlessly. Morning offerings. Midday labor. Evening meals. Night work. Then dawn returning once more beside the Nile. Above the city, the sunlight slowly softened into deeper gold while inside the sanctuary, the scent of incense still floated quietly through the cool dim chambers where the gods remained silent and unmoving as generations of tired workers passed through the temple year after year. As the afternoon slowly gave way to evening, the ancient town seemed to exhale. The hardest heat of the day loosened its grip little by little. Warm air still drifted through the streets, but the burning brightness above had softened into long golden light stretching across rooftops and temple walls. Workers noticed the change immediately. Movements became less strained. Conversations returned quietly to the markets and courtyards. Even the animals seemed calmer beneath the fading sun. Near the temple bakery, Hori poured water slowly over his hands beside a clay basin darkened with ash and flour. The water turned cloudy as it ran across his skin and onto the dusty ground below. His shoulders hurt deeply now. Years beside the ovens had shaped his body into constant tiredness. His back remained slightly bent even while standing still. Fine lines from heat and smoke marked the corners of his eyes. Yet there was comfort in evening routines. The labor of the day was not finished, but its pace had changed. The desperate urgency of morning offerings had passed. Workers no longer rushed between tasks with the same pressure. Nebu sat nearby eating a small piece of bread in silence. Ash covered his knees and elbows. He looked toward the open courtyard where sunlight glowed against the temple columns in soft orange colors. For a moment, neither of them moved. The bakery fires still crackled behind them, though less fiercely now. Outside the temple walls, the market district slowly awakened again after the heavy afternoon stillness. Merchants uncovered baskets that had been protected from the worst sunlight earlier in the day. Buyers returned carrying empty jars and woven bags. Dust floated through the evening air. A woman selling onions rearranged her goods beneath a fabric shade while nearby a fish seller sprinkled water over the day's remaining catch to keep it from drying completely before nightfall. Children moved between the stalls chasing one another through narrow paths crowded with baskets and pottery. Their laughter rose briefly above the slower sounds of the market before fading again into the warm evening air. The smells of the city changed as darkness approached. Fresh bread emerged once more from household ovens. Cooking lentils simmered over small fires. Smoke drifted upward between rooftops. Dates and figs warmed gently in shallow bowls. Near the riverbank, fishermen prepared for another night upon the Nile. Didu tightened rope around a stack of folded nets while watching the sunlight shimmer across the water. The river reflected the golden sky in broken patterns moving slowly with the current. Nearby, another fisherman patched a tear in the side of a small wooden boat using strips of reed fiber and sticky resin softened by heat. The evening breeze carried coolness from the water now. Not cold. Only softer than the dry air inside the city streets. Birds crossed low over the river in dark shapes against the fading light. Reeds whispered gently along the muddy shore. The Nile itself seemed calmer during these hours. Many workers loved evening beside the river more than any other time of day. The heat faded. The noise of labor softened. The sky became larger somehow as shadows stretched across the valley. Farther beyond the city, farmers gathered animals toward their enclosures while the last sunlight touched the tops of palm trees beside the canals. Beckett walked slowly through his field checking the water channels before nightfall. Mud clung to his sandals. His sons followed behind carrying tools across their shoulders. The fields smelled rich after the long heat. Wet soil. Crushed plants. Canal water cooling beneath evening air. Frogs had already begun calling softly from the reeds nearby. Beckett paused beside the irrigation canal and looked toward the distant temple rising above the town. Its pale walls glowed warmly beneath the setting sun. From here, the temple appeared peaceful and still. Yet he knew countless workers continued moving inside those walls even now. Servants carrying lamps. Scribes finishing records. Bakers preparing tomorrow's bread. Guards watching gates. The sacred world required endless care. Back inside the temple complex, servants moved quietly through the corridors lighting oil lamps one by one. Tiny flames flickered against painted walls as daylight slowly disappeared from the inner halls. The temple changed completely after sunset. During the day, sunlight entered courtyards and open passageways, revealing every color painted across the stone. But at night, most rooms glowed only with soft firelight. Shadows deepened. Columns disappeared into darkness overhead. The smell of oil smoke mixed with lingering incense from the rituals earlier in the day. Painasi walked slowly through one inner chamber carrying a small clay lamp before him. The flame trembled gently whenever he moved. The sanctuary beyond remained quiet and cool. Offering tables had been cleared earlier, though faint scents of bread, flowers, and incense still rested in the air. He paused beside a painted wall showing scenes of riverboats and offering processions. The colors looked softer beneath the dim light. Blue water. White linen. Golden trays of bread and fruit. Images of routines repeated endlessly across generations. Even the paintings seemed calm during these evening hours. Outside the sanctuary, temple servants prepared simple meals for priests and workers who remained inside the complex through the night. Bread was divided carefully. Beer poured into clay cups. Bowls of lentils and onions passed from hand to hand. Most people ate quietly from exhaustion. In one shaded corner near the kitchens, several workers sat against the wall sharing food while warm night air drifted through the courtyard. Their clothing smelled of smoke and dust after the long day. One older laborer rubbed his knees slowly before eating. Another stared silently toward the darkening sky above the courtyard opening. Bodies worn by years of labor often moved more slowly at night. Yet tomorrow would arrive quickly. Everyone understood this. Near the storage halls, scribes completed the final records before sealing the doors for evening. Clay markers pressed with official stamps were attached carefully beside wooden locks. One scribe stretched his stiff fingers after hours bent over papyrus. His eyes burned from lamp smoke and dust. Still, the records had to be completed before rest. Nothing inside the temple existed without counting. Not grain. Not oil. Not fish. Not cloth. The temple was both sacred place and enormous living machine held together by human hands. Outside the city, darkness spread steadily across the Nile Valley. The western horizon glowed briefly in deep orange before fading into soft blue-gray. Stars slowly appeared overhead one by one. Families climbed ladders toward their rooftops carrying blankets and water jars for the night. Rooftop sleeping places offered relief from the lingering warmth trapped inside mud brick homes below. Across the city, quiet conversations drifted through the darkness. Parents speaking softly. Children growing sleepy beneath the stars. Neighbors exchanging tired words after the long day. Oil lamps flicker gently in small windows and open courtyards. The town became calmer with every passing hour. Near the riverbank, Didu and the fishermen finally pushed their boat into the Nile once more. The wood scraped softly against mud before floating free into the dark water. The river reflected moonlight now. Silver lines moved slowly across the surface beside the boat. Oars dipped quietly into the current while insects hummed near the reeds along shore. Far behind them, the temple lamps glowed faintly above the sleeping city. Inside the sacred halls, Painasi extinguished several smaller lamps before preparing for rest. Shadows deepened across the painted chambers while only a few flames remained burning near important doorways. The cool stone beneath his sandals held traces of the day's warmth. Somewhere deeper inside the complex, a servant still swept dust from a corridor by lamplight. Another checked water jars for the morning rituals. In the bakery courtyard, Nebu stacked fresh wood beside the ovens before finally lying down near the wall to sleep for a few short hours. The smell of ash lingered around him. Above, the stars stretched endlessly over Egypt once more. The Nile flowed quietly through the darkness. And across the rooftops of the ancient town, tired workers slowly closed their eyes while tomorrow's offerings waited silently in the stillness before dawn. Deep into the night, the ancient town rested beneath a sky full of cold white stars. The noise of the day had faded almost completely now. Markets stood empty beneath folded cloth coverings. Courtyards lay still. Cooking fires had burned low until only faint glowing embers remained inside clay hearths. A warm breeze drifted softly through the narrow streets. Dust moved gently along the ground where thousands of footsteps had passed earlier beneath the sun. The mud brick walls held traces of heat from the long day, though cooler air slowly settled over the city hour by hour. Across the rooftops, families slept close together beneath linen cloths and woven blankets. Some turned quietly in their sleep while others remained completely still beneath the moonlight. From far away came the slow steady sound of the Nile. Water touching reeds. Boats shifting against ropes. Soft splashes somewhere in the darkness. The river continued moving whether people slept or woke. Near the temple walls, guards walked slowly along shadowed passageways carrying spears and small oil lamps. Their sandals brushed softly across the stone floors while firelight trembled against the painted columns beside them. One guard stopped briefly beside an outer gate and looked upward toward the stars. The night air felt good after the heat of day. He leaned his spear against the wall for a moment and stretched his aching shoulders before continuing his slow path through the sleeping complex. Inside the temple itself, silence rested heavily within the sacred halls. Most lamps had been extinguished hours earlier. Only a few small flames remained glowing near important doorways and inner chambers. Their light barely reached the high-painted ceilings above. The sanctuary smelled faintly of incense and old stone. Offerings from earlier in the day had already been removed and redistributed among workers. The tables now stood mostly empty, waiting quietly for dawn and the beginning of another cycle. Painasi slept in a small chamber near the inner halls. A folded linen cloth rested beneath his head while his breathing remained slow and even in the darkness. Priests often slept lightly. Years of rising before dawn trained the body to expect waking long before sunrise. Nearby, another older priest coughed softly in his sleep before turning onto one side. The room remained otherwise still except for the occasional crackle from a distant lamp flame somewhere down the corridor. Farther away, in the bakery courtyard, Nebu lay asleep beside stacked firewood near the ovens. The ground beneath him remained warm from the fires that had burned throughout the day. Ash dusted his clothing. One arm rested across his face to block the moonlight. His sleep was deep with exhaustion. Many workers throughout the city slept this way, with tired bodies sinking heavily into rest the moment labor finally stopped. Near the riverbank, however, not everyone slept. Didu and the other fishermen drifted quietly across the Nile beneath the moon and stars. Their small wooden boat moved slowly through silver reflections trembling across the water. The night river felt peaceful in a way daytime never allowed. Cool air touched their skin. The sounds of the city faded behind them. Only insects, frogs, water, and quiet voices remained. One fisherman lowered a net carefully into the dark current while another steadied the boat with slow movements of the oar. Nobody spoke loudly. The night seemed too calm for noise. Above them, stars reflected faintly across the surface of the river, broken apart whenever fish moved beneath the water. Along the muddy banks, reeds swayed gently in the breeze. Small birds hidden among them shifted occasionally in sleep. The fishermen worked patiently. Hours passed slowly on the Nile. Sometimes the nets came up heavy. Sometimes nearly empty. Still they returned night after night because the city and temple always needed more fish. Back within the sleeping town, a baby cried softly from one rooftop before being comforted again by its mother. Nearby, an old man sat awake for a while beside a clay water jar, unable to sleep fully in the warm night air. He listened quietly to distant dogs barking somewhere near the edge of the city. Then silence returned again. The rooftops smelled faintly of dust, cooling brick, and old smoke carried upward from cooking fires below. Many people preferred sleeping beneath the open sky whenever the weather allowed. Inside the homes, the heat often became trapped within the thick mud brick walls long after sunset. Up here, at least, the breeze could still be felt. Toward the edge of the town, several donkeys slept tied beside stacked baskets waiting for tomorrow's market goods. Their ears twitched occasionally against flies even during the night. Nearby, clay jars stood lined against one wall filled with grain collected earlier from nearby villages. Everything waited quietly now. The baskets. The boats. The ovens. The storerooms. Waiting for dawn to begin moving again. Hours later, the stars had shifted farther west across the sky when the first signs of waking slowly returned to the temple grounds. One servant stirred beside a corridor wall where he had fallen asleep during a short break between duties. He rubbed his eyes heavily and sat upright listening to the deep silence around him. Not dawn yet. But close enough that the body already sensed it. In the bakery courtyard, Nebu turned in his sleep as faint cooler air moved through the open space between the walls. The ovens had dimmed into deep red embers now. Soon the fires would need feeding again. Inside the storage halls, mice rustled softly among grain sacks hidden deep in the darkness. Somewhere water dripped slowly into a clay basin. The temple felt enormous during these quiet hours. Long corridors disappeared into shadow. Painted figures watched silently from walls no sunlight touched. The stone itself seemed to hold memories of countless mornings and nights repeating across generations. At the river, the fisherman finally began rowing back toward shore. Didu's arms ached from hours of pulling nets through the water. The boat carried a moderate catch tonight. Enough to satisfy the market sellers and temple buyers for another day. As they approached land, the eastern horizon showed the faintest hint of pale gray beneath the stars. Morning was approaching again. The fishermen pulled the boat onto the muddy shore with tired slow movements. Wet nets glistened faintly in the dim light. Fish shifted weakly inside woven baskets lined with reeds. Birds had not yet begun singing. The world still belonged mostly to darkness. But Egypt was beginning to wake. Back inside the town, a woman rose quietly from beside her sleeping children and climbed down from the rooftop to prepare the morning fire. Her sandals touched the ladder softly rung by rung. In another home, a baker's wife poured grain into a grinding stone before the sun had even touched the horizon. Near the temple walls, One guard yawned deeply while another adjusted the cloth around his shoulders against the slight coolness before dawn. The ancient city moved gently between sleeping and waking. And deep within the temple sanctuary, where only faint oil lamps still glowed against painted walls, tomorrow's offering tables already waited empty and silent for bread, flowers, incense, oil, fruit, and prayer to return once more with the rising sun beside the Nile River. Before the sun appeared, the Nile Valley existed in a brief and gentle stillness between night and morning. The stars had begun fading softly from the sky, though darkness still rested over the rooftops and narrow streets. A pale gray light stretched low across the eastern horizon beyond the riverbanks, touching the edges of palm trees and distant fields. The air felt cooler now than it had for many hours. Workers waking before dawn noticed it immediately. For a short time each morning, breathing became easier. In the bakery courtyard beside the temple kitchens, Nebu opened his eyes slowly and sat upright against the wall where he had slept. Ash still covered his clothing from the previous day. His body ached from carrying wood and kneading dough, but already he could hear movement beginning around him. Footsteps. Quiet voices. The scrape of clay bowls against stone. The temple was waking again. Nebu stood and stretched his stiff shoulders before walking toward the ovens. Their fires had faded during the night into glowing beds of deep red embers beneath white ash. He knelt beside them carefully. Soon fresh wood cracked softly as flames slowly returned to life. The smell of smoke spread gently through the courtyard. Above the walls, the sky brightened little by little. Hori arrived not long after, moving slowly through the gate with heavy tired steps. His eyes still carried sleep, but years of labor had trained his body to wake before dawn without needing thought. He nodded quietly toward Nebu before beginning work beside the grain tables. Nearby, another worker poured water into large clay bowls while a younger boy carried sacks of emmer wheat from the storage rooms. The sound of grinding stone soon joined the growing rhythm of the courtyard. Stone against grain. Water splashing. Fire crackling. The beginning of another day. Elsewhere within the temple grounds, servants moved through dim corridors carrying oil lamps before them. Shadows shifted gently across painted walls while cool morning air drifted through the open courtyards. One servant swept dust from the sanctuary entrance with slow careful motions. Another cleaned offering bowls using damp linen cloths beside a basin of water. Nothing inside the temple was allowed to appear neglected before the morning rituals began. Purity and order shaped every action. Even in darkness, workers prepared the sacred halls with patience learned over many years. Painasi rose quietly from his sleeping chamber and washed himself beside a stone basin. The water felt cold against his hands and face after the warmth of the night. Nearby, folded white linen garments rested neatly upon a wooden stool prepared the evening before. The chamber smelled faintly of lamp smoke and old incense lingering within the stone walls. As he dressed, Painasi listened to the distant sounds spreading slowly through the temple complex. Bakery fires. Footsteps crossing courtyards. Wooden doors opening. Voices low with early exhaustion. Morning labor had begun again. Outside the city walls, farmers also stirred awake beside canals and animal pens. Beckett stepped from his home into the cool pre-dawn air while the stars still remained visible overhead. Nearby, goats shifted softly inside their enclosure and a rooster called once into the fading darkness. The fields beyond looked silver-gray beneath the coming dawn. Moisture clung lightly to reeds near the irrigation canals. Frogs slipped quietly into the water as Beckett approached carrying empty jars across his shoulders. For a few moments, the valley felt peaceful and untouched. Soon the heat would return. Soon workers would bend beneath the sun once more. but right now the world still moved gently and slowly. Near the riverbank, Didu and the fishermen unloaded their catch from the night. Their muscles trembled with fatigue after hours upon the water. Fish glistened faintly inside woven baskets lined with damp reeds. Nets hung heavily across wooden poles while birds circled overhead waiting for scraps. The Nile moved silently behind them. Mist floated low above parts of the river where cool air touched warmer water. Didu washed his face beside the muddy shore and stared for a moment toward the pale horizon where daylight slowly approached. He had not yet slept. Soon the market sellers and temple buyers would arrive to inspect the catch. Then he would return home for a few hours of rest before evening repairs began again. Life beside the river rarely paused. Back inside the city, the first cooking fires appeared one by one. Thin streams of smoke rose into the brightening sky above the rooftops. Women ground grain beside open doorways while children still slept wrapped in blankets nearby. The town smelled of ash, dust, damp earth, and fresh bread beginning to bake. A donkey brayed somewhere near the market district. Another answered farther away. Soon merchants would begin opening their stalls again. In the temple kitchens, heat returned quickly as the ovens strengthened. Hori pressed dough across wooden boards while sweat already formed along his forehead despite the early hour. The bakery courtyard glowed orange from firelight mixed with pale dawn. Nebu carried fresh wood again and again between the stacked piles and the ovens. Smoke drifted around him while ash clung to his feet. The labor felt endless because it was endless. Bread was needed every day. For workers. For priests. For offerings. For storage. The temple consumed enormous amounts of grain from sunrise until nightfall. Nearby, brewers stirred thick barley mixtures inside clay vats while servants carried clean trays toward the sanctuary halls. One older worker coughed heavily from smoke before wiping his mouth with the edge of his linen garment. No one stopped moving. As the eastern sky turned from gray into soft gold, the tops of the temple walls caught the first sunlight of morning. A warm line of brightness spread slowly downward across the stone. Birds began calling from the palm trees near the river. The city fully awakened. Market sellers arranged vegetables beneath woven shades. Water carriers crossed dusty streets balancing jars against their shoulders. Children climbed down from rooftops rubbing sleep from their eyes. Donkeys pulled carts loaded with onions, grain, reeds, and fish toward the crowded districts near the temple gates. Dust rose beneath countless footsteps. The ancient world returned once more to motion. Inside the sanctuary, Panasi lit fresh incense before the offering tables while the chamber remained cool and dim compared to the brightening courtyards outside. The scent curled slowly upward through beams of early sunlight entering high above. Soon the first offerings would arrive. Bread still warm from the ovens. Fresh fish from the river. Lotus flowers floating in shallow bowls. Beer poured carefully into clay cups. Oil for the lamps. Fruit gathered from gardens along the Nile. All prepared through the labor of ordinary hands long before sunrise. Tiaa entered the temple carrying fresh lotus blossoms beside her daughter. The petals still held traces of cool moisture from the morning air. Servants stepped carefully aside as she passed through the corridor toward the inner halls. The flowers smelled soft and clean against the heavier scent of incense and lamp smoke. Outside, the sunlight widened across the city. Stone columns glowed pale gold. The Nile reflected the sky in trembling patterns of brightness. Workers crossed courtyards carrying baskets and jars while scribes entered storage halls already preparing another day of records and counting. The same rhythms repeated. Morning after morning. Year after year. Generation after generation beside the river. and as the first sacred offerings of the new day were placed before the silent gods, countless laborers across the city continued their quiet work beneath the rising Egyptian sun. The sun climbed steadily above the Nile Valley, bringing warmth back to the city one slow layer at a time. At first the light remained soft against the rooftops and temple walls. The air still carried traces of coolness from the night. But already workers understood how quickly the morning calm would disappear beneath the growing heat. Inside the temple complex, movement spread through every courtyard and corridor. Servants crossed the stone paths carrying baskets filled with bread and vegetables. Scribes hurried carefully beneath shaded walkways with papyrus rolls tucked beneath their arms. Bakers lifted fresh loaves from the ovens while brewers sealed jars with damp clay stoppers. The sounds blended together into the familiar rhythm of another working day. Footsteps on stone. Wood cracking in fires. Birds calling above the columns. Voices low with concentration and fatigue. Near the bakery courtyard, Hori wiped flour from his hands and leaned briefly against the warm wall beside the ovens. His face already glistened with sweat. The fires burned fiercely now. Heat rolled outward in heavy waves whenever oven doors opened. Smoke drifted upward toward the pale blue sky visible above the courtyard. Nebula carried another armful of wood toward the fires and dropped it carefully beside the clay ovens. Tiny sparks floated upward as fresh logs were pushed into the flames. His arms trembled slightly from exhaustion. Still, he continued moving. Most temple workers learned to ignore discomfort whenever possible. Sore muscles, smoke-filled lungs, cracked skin, and endless tiredness belonged to ordinary life. Nearby, a younger boy shaped smaller loaves using wooden molds carved with sacred symbols meant for the offering tables. His fingers pressed carefully into the soft dough while older bakers watched closely. Mistakes meant wasted grain. Nothing inside the temple kitchens could be careless. Outside the bakery walls, sunlight spread wider across the city streets. The market district had fully awakened now. Merchants called softly to passing buyers while arranging goods beneath woven coverings stretched overhead for shade. Clay jars lined the edges of stalls. Bundles of onions hung beside dried fish and woven baskets. The smell of the market deepened as the morning warmed. Fresh bread. Dates. Animal sweat. Dust. Fish from the river. Smoke drifting upward from nearby cooking fires. A woman carrying a sleeping child stopped beside a vegetable seller to inspect cucumbers laid carefully across damp reeds. Nearby, an old man repaired sandals beneath a shaded corner while flies circled lazily around him. Donkey carts rattled slowly through the crowded paths carrying grain sacks toward the temple storerooms. The city felt fully alive now. Near the Nile, fishermen sorted the night's catch beside the muddy shore. Didu crouched beside woven baskets while temple buyers inspected the freshest fish first. Silver scales reflected brightly beneath the morning sunlight. Birds circled overhead waiting for scraps tossed onto the riverbank. One buyer lifted a fish carefully, examining the eyes and gills before nodding toward the basket beside him. Temple kitchens demanded freshness for the sacred meals prepared each morning. Didu watched silently while the fish were counted. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes from another sleepless night upon the water. His hands were rough and cracked from rope, mud, and river water. Yet the Nile remained generous enough to keep him returning again and again. Behind him, the river moved calmly past the city walls, reflecting sunlight in endless shifting patterns. Farther from the town, farmers bent low beside the canals gathering vegetables before the worst heat arrived. Beckett stood ankle-deep in damp soil pulling onions from the earth while his sons loaded baskets nearby. Palm trees swayed softly beyond the fields. The morning air smelled rich beside the water channels. Wet mud. Crushed plants. Fresh reeds. Birdsong drifted across the fields while dragonflies moved above the canals in flashes of blue and green. The work remained tiring even during the cooler hours. Still, mornings in the fields often felt more peaceful than the crowded city streets. There was space to breathe here. Space to hear the river and birds instead of shouting merchants and grinding stone. Beckett paused briefly and stretched his aching back before returning to the rows again. The temple would require deliveries before midday. Inside the sacred sanctuary, Painassi stood before the offering tables while incense smoke curled slowly upward into the dim chamber above him. The room remained cool compared to the brightness outside. Stone columns rose into shadow overhead. Painted figures along the walls seemed almost alive beneath the flickering lamplight. Fresh offerings now filled the tables. Bread arranged neatly in rows. Fish from the Nile. Beer in clay cups. Figs and dates. Lotus flowers floating gently in shallow bowls of water. The scents mixed together softly in the still air. Incense. Warm bread. Flower petals. Oil smoke. Painassi spoke the prayers quietly and steadily, his voice barely louder than the movement of the incense itself. Outside these sacred rooms, ordinary workers continued carrying, cleaning, recording, lifting, washing, and preparing without pause. A servant scrubbed stone floors near the sanctuary entrance using wet linen cloths. Another polished bronze bowls until they reflected the lamp flames. Two laborers carried water jars through the corridors with bent shoulders and careful steps. The sacred world rested upon ordinary labor. Every offering upon the tables had passed through many hands before reaching the gods. Hands stained with flour. Hands cracked from farming. Hands rough from fishing nets. Hands smelling of flowers, oil, smoke, mud, and river water. In the temple storerooms, scribes recorded the morning deliveries while workers stacked grain sacks into towering rows along the walls. The air inside remained dusty and warm. One older scribe dipped his reed brush carefully into dark ink before marking another line across the papyrus. Sweat rolled slowly down the side of his face. Nearby, laborers carried jars of beer from the brewery chambers where thick barley mixtures still bubbled inside enormous clay vats. The brewers themselves worked half-covered in sweat. The brewery smelled sour and heavy. Wet grain. Yeast. Smoke. Spilled beer soaking into the floor. One worker stirred a vat slowly using a wooden paddle nearly as tall as himself. Another sealed finished jars using damp clay pressed firmly around cloth coverings. The work required strength and patience. By now, the sunlight in the outer courtyards had grown brighter and sharper. Shadows shortened gradually across the stone. Temple guards shifted uncomfortably beneath the warmth while searching constantly for places where even small amounts of shade remained. Pigeons gathered beneath roof edges. Dogs slept beside carts. Children carried water jars through the streets while dust clung to their feet and ankles. In homes across the city, women prepared the day's first larger meals while elderly relatives rested indoors away from the increasing heat. Grainstones scraped rhythmically beside cooking fires. The smell of lentils and baking bread drifted through open doorways. Many homes remained dim even during daytime because the small windows allowed little sunlight inside. Thick mud brick walls protected families from the worst heat whenever possible. Still, the warmth slowly entered everywhere by late morning. Near the flower workshops, TIAA sorted remaining lotus blossoms beneath a shaded covering stretched between two walls. Some flowers would be saved for later rituals. Others were already beginning to wilt beneath the rising heat. Her daughter sat nearby weaving thin garlands from herbs and reeds. The work required calm hands, patience, care. The flowers bruised easily if handled too roughly. Tia dipped another blossom into cool water and adjusted its petals gently while voices from the busy streets drifted faintly through the distance. Beyond the rooftops, the Nile shimmered brightly beneath the growing sun. Boats crossed slowly between villages carrying grain, reeds, pottery, and vegetables toward the city. The river connected every part of life together. The farms, the markets, the temples, the fishermen, the bakers, the priests. Everything moved according to its rhythm. And as the morning slowly deepened toward another long hot afternoon, the ancient city continued its endless cycle of offerings and labor beneath the widening Egyptian sky. By late morning, the sunlight over the city had become bright enough to blur the edges of distant buildings. The temple walls glowed pale beneath the widening heat. Dust drifted lazily through the streets where countless sandals and cartwheels had already passed since dawn. The air itself seemed heavier now, carrying the warmth rising from stone courtyards and mud brick homes. Still the work continued. Inside the temple kitchens, Hori pressed dough across the wooden preparation table while sweat rolled steadily down his arms. The bakery courtyard roared with heat and movement. Ovens crackled. Clay bowls scraped against stone. Workers crossed constantly between the fires and storage rooms carrying sacks of grain or baskets of finished bread. Nebu moved carefully through the crowded space, balancing a stack of flat loaves against his chest. Ash streaked his legs and clothing. Smoke drifted around him in pale clouds whenever fresh wood was thrown into the flames. The smell inside the bakery had become thick and powerful. Warm grain, burning wood, yeast, sweat, hot clay. It clung to the workers long after they left each evening. Near one wall, an older baker sat briefly on an overturned basket, rubbing his wrists before standing again to continue kneading dough. His fingers had swollen from years of labor. No one expected comfort inside the kitchens. The ovens demanded constant attention. Outside, the city streets shimmered faintly beneath the growing heat. Merchants in the market district adjusted woven shades above their stalls while buyers moved more slowly now between the crowded paths. A fish seller poured water over his remaining catch while flies circled above the baskets. Nearby, a woman selling figs fanned herself with a bundle of reeds while watching the dusty road for customers. Children carried small clay cups filled with watered beer for tired workers resting near the edges of the market. The smells of midday approached gradually. Dry dust warming beneath the sun. Animal sweat. Smoke drifting upward from cooking fires. Dates softening in woven trays. Along one shaded corner, an old storyteller sat against a wall speaking quietly to a few children gathered near his feet. His voice rose and fell gently beneath the market noise while pigeons fluttered overhead between the rooftops. Beyond the city, the Nile reflected the harsh sunlight in flashing silver patterns across its slow-moving surface. The fishermen had mostly disappeared now into shaded homes or riverside shelters to rest after the night's work. Didu lay asleep beneath a simple reed covering near the shore, one arm resting across his eyes against the brightness. Nearby, his nets hung drying from wooden poles. The river breeze moved softly through them. A few boats still crossed the water carrying vegetables and grain toward the temple docks. The sound of oars dipping into the Nile reached the shore in slow, steady rhythms. At the farming villages outside the city, labor continued beneath the strengthening sun. Beckett and his sons worked silently beside the irrigation canals. Their feet sank into wet soil while insects hummed above the water nearby. The heat pressed heavily against their backs now. Still, the fields needed attention before midday became unbearable. One son carried baskets of onions toward the shaded edge of the canal while another cleared mud blocking the water flow between vegetable rows. Palm trees swayed slowly above them. Birdsong had grown quieter beneath the heat. Only the endless sounds of labor remained. Water splashing. Mud shifting beneath sandals. Breathing rough with exhaustion. The Nile Valley survived through routines like these repeated every day across countless generations. Back within the temple complex, the sanctuary remained dim and cool compared to the burning brightness outside. Panasi stood near the offering tables replacing oil inside several lamps that had nearly burned empty during the morning rituals. The flames flickered softly against painted walls. Blue stars covered the ceiling above. Sacred figures watched silently from every direction. The chamber smelled of incense and warm oil. For a moment, the sanctuary felt removed from the harshness beyond the temple walls. Yet even here, the sacred calm depended entirely upon ordinary workers continuing their endless tasks outside. Servants carried fresh water through the corridors. Cleaners swept away dust blowing in from the courtyards. Scribes updated delivery records. Kitchen workers prepared more bread. Without them, the rituals themselves could not continue. Near the storerooms, two laborers struggled to shift a heavy grain sack onto a wooden platform. Their breathing grew strained as dust rose around them. An older scribe nearby recorded the grain count while wiping sweat from his forehead with a linen cloth darkened from use. Papyrus sheets covered the table before him. Lines of numbers and symbols filled the pages in careful rows. The temple measured everything. Bread, oil, fish, beer, cloth, flowers. Even the smallest missing item could bring questions from supervisors already exhausted by constant responsibility. Inside the brewery chambers, the heat had become almost unbearable. Steam rose from the large clay vats while workers stirred thick barley mixtures using long wooden paddles. Their linen garments clung heavily to sweat-covered skin. The sour smell of fermenting grain filled the room. One brewer paused briefly to drink water from a clay cup before returning to the vat beside him. Another worker sealed completed beer jars with damp clay and linen coverings. The brewery floor remained sticky beneath their feet from spilled liquid and grain. Flies gathered constantly near the corners of the room. Farther inside the temple workshops, craftsmen continued their quieter labor away from the crowded kitchens. The old painter repairing offering chests leaned close to his work while tiny brushes moved slowly across carved wood. His eyes narrowed carefully beneath the dim light entering through the doorway. Nearby, a young apprentice polished bronze ritual bowls using sand and cloth until the surfaces reflected light softly like still water. The workshop smelled of oil, wood dust, heated metal, and old stone. Outside, the city drifted steadily toward midday. The shadows shortened. The sunlight sharpened. Dogs searched for cooler places beneath carts and stairways. Donkeys stood motionless beside walls while flies buzzed around their ears. In homes throughout the city, women prepared midday meals before the strongest heat arrived. Lentils simmered slowly. Flatbread cooled on woven mats. Children sat quietly indoors where the thick walls held a little shade. Many people rested whenever possible during these hours. Yet for temple workers, true rest rarely lasted long. Hori stepped briefly from the bakery courtyard and stood near the shaded side of a wall. His face and arms were covered in flour and sweat. He closed his eyes for a moment. The small breeze moving through the courtyard felt precious against his skin. Nearby, Nebu sat beside the woodpile drinking water carefully from a clay jar. His hands shook slightly from exhaustion. Soon they would both return to the ovens. Soon more bread would need shaping. More fires feeding. More baskets carrying toward the sanctuary. The work moved in circles that never truly ended. Near the flower preparation area, Tiaa and her daughter continued sorting lotus blossoms for later rituals. Some petals had already begun curling beneath the heat despite the damp cloths placed around them. Tiaa adjusted the flowers gently one by one. The scent of lotus mixed softly with the dust and smoke drifting through the city air. Beyond the rooftops, the Nile shimmered beneath the growing white brightness of noon. Boats moved slowly across the river. Palm trees bent lazily in the hot breeze. And throughout the ancient city, ordinary workers carried on with the endless preparations that kept the sacred world alive beneath the Egyptian sun. At midday, the heat settled over the city with full strength. The sunlight pouring across the Nile Valley had turned nearly white above the temple roofs and crowded streets. Stone courtyards reflected warmth upward in shimmering waves. Dust clung to damp skin and clothing. Even the air moving through the city felt dry and tired. People slowed beneath it. Voices softened. Footsteps became heavier. The ancient town entered the long difficult hours between noon and evening. Inside the temple bakery, the ovens glowed fiercely against the walls. Hori stood near the fires shaping dough with movements that had become almost automatic after so many years. His hands no longer needed thought. Press. Fold. Turn. Lift. Again and again. Sweat rolled steadily down his face and darkened the linen cloth around his waist. The smoke irritated his eyes until they burned constantly beneath the heat. Nearby, Nebu carried another load of wood toward the ovens, though his pace had slowed now. The boy's shoulders drooped with exhaustion. Ash covered nearly every part of him. One older baker noticed and handed him a small piece of bread without speaking. Nebu accepted it quietly and sat for a few moments against the wall beside the woodpile. The bakery courtyard smelled thick with smoke and hot grain. Tiny sparks drifted upward whenever the oven doors opened. Workers moved through the haze like shadows crossing firelight. Outside, the temple courtyards appeared almost empty beneath the worst heat of the day. Only essential movement continued. Servants carrying water. Guards walking slowly beneath shaded walls. Laborers transporting grain or jars between storerooms. Most people avoided crossing the open spaces whenever possible. Even the pigeons had retreated beneath the roof edges where narrow strips of shade remained. In the market district, woven coverings stretched tightly overhead to block the burning sunlight. Merchants sat quietly behind their goods fanning themselves with reeds or scraps of cloth. A fruit seller poured water over figs and dates to keep them from drying too quickly. Nearby, a woman rested with her back against a wall while her small child slept beside baskets of onions. The smell of the city changed during these hours. Hot dust. Animal sweat. Sun-warmed fruit. Dry reeds. Clay baking beneath the light. Near one corner of the market, a water seller moved slowly between the stalls balancing heavy jars across a wooden pole resting on his shoulders. His face shone with sweat. People paused him often during the midday heat. Small clay cups passed from hand to hand while warm water disappeared quickly into thirsty mouths. Beyond the city walls, the fields beside the Nile shimmered beneath the brightness. Many farmers had temporarily retreated into shaded shelters built from reeds and mud near the irrigation canals. Beckett sat beneath one of these coverings with his sons resting nearby. No one spoke very much. The heat made speech feel unnecessary. One son dipped a cloth into canal water and pressed it against his neck. Another leaned back against a basket of onions with closed eyes while insects hummed lazily beyond the shade. The Nile moved quietly nearby. Its water reflected blinding light across the edges of the fields. Palm leaves rattled softly whenever the wind shifted through them. Even during rest, work waited. Tools leaned beside the shelter wall. Half-filled baskets sat nearby in the dust. Soon the labor would begin again once the sun lowered slightly. At the riverbank, Dida remained asleep beneath his reed covering while his fishing nets dried nearby. Flies buzzed around the edges of the boat resting upside down beside him. The fishermen often slept through much of the day whenever possible. Night belonged to their labor. Still, the heat found them even in sleep. The smell of river mud and drying fish lingered heavily in the air around the shore. Back within the temple sanctuary, the atmosphere remained calmer than anywhere outside. Painasi sat beside a low stone table reviewing ritual texts while faint incense drifted through the dim chamber. The thick walls protected the room from the harsh sunlight beyond. Oil lamps flickered gently. Painted figures watched from the walls. The coolness inside felt almost unreal compared to the blazing courtyards outside. Yet even here, the heat slowly entered through the stone itself as the day stretched onward. A servant carrying fresh water moved quietly through the corridor and bowed slightly before placing a clay jar near the chamber entrance. The water inside remained cooler than outside because the jar had been wrapped earlier in damp cloth. Painasi thanked him softly. The servant nodded and disappeared again into the shadowed hallway. Farther within the temple complex, the storerooms remained busy despite the oppressive heat. Laborers continued shifting supplies through narrow dusty aisles lined with grain sacks and beer jars. The air inside felt thick and difficult to breathe. One worker paused beside a stack of baskets to wipe sweat from his arms before lifting another heavy load onto his shoulder. Nearby, the elderly scribe continued marking records onto papyrus while tiny beads of sweat gathered along his brow. The work required constant attention. Nothing stopped because of heat. Not the grain deliveries. Not the beer counts. Not the preparation of offerings. The temple moved steadily forward beneath every season and every hour of the day. Inside the brewery chambers, workers stirred the heavy barley mixtures more slowly now. Their movements had become tired and deliberate. Steam mixed with heat from outside until the room felt almost unbearable. One brewer leaned against the wall briefly while another sealed finished jars using clay pressed carefully around linen coverings. The smell of fermenting grain clung to every surface. Wet barley. Yeast. Smoke. Sweat. The floors remained sticky beneath worn sandals. Elsewhere, in the temple workshops, the craftsmen continued quieter labor away from the crowded kitchens and breweries. The old painter rested his brush for a moment and flexed stiff fingers before returning to the carved offering chest before him. The younger apprentice nearby polished bronze bowls slowly while sunlight entering the doorway glowed against floating dust in the room. The workshop carried a calmer rhythm. Less shouting. Less rushing. Only steady careful work continuing through the long afternoon. In homes across the city, many families rested indoors where mud brick walls provided small relief from the burning sunlight. Children slept on woven mats while older relatives sat quietly near open doorways searching for moving air. Cooking fires had grown smaller during the hottest hours. Most meals now were simple. Bread. Lentils. Onions. Beer watered down against thirst. Women ground grain slowly beside stone mills while listening to distant market sounds drifting through the streets outside. The entire city seemed wrapped in warmth and exhaustion. Stillness settled over many rooftops and courtyards. Even the animals moved carefully now. Dogs slept with tongues hanging from their mouths. Donkeys stood motionless in narrow strips of shade. Birdsong had mostly disappeared beneath the afternoon heat. Near the flower preparation area, TIAA replaced damp cloths around the lotus blossoms to keep them fresh a little longer. Some petals had already softened despite her efforts. She dipped another flower gently into cool water while her daughter rearranged bundles of herbs beside her. The scent of lotus floated softly through the shaded workspace. For a few moments, the fragrance almost covered the smell of dust and heat surrounding the city. Beyond the temple walls, the Nile continued flowing beneath the blazing sky. Boats drifted slowly across the river carrying grain, vegetables, pottery, and reeds between villages and markets. Their reflections trembled across the bright water like moving pieces of light. And throughout the ancient city, beneath the endless sun of Egypt, workers carried on quietly with the ordinary labor that prepared each morning's offerings day after day beside the river. Slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, the afternoon began to soften. The sunlight above the Nile Valley remained bright, but its harsh white glare started turning warmer as the sun moved westward across the sky. Long shadows slowly returned to the edges of walls and narrow alleys. Workers lifting their eyes toward the horizon could feel the smallest promise of relief approaching. The city breathed differently during these hours. Not rested. Not refreshed. Only less burdened than at midday. Inside the temple bakery, Hori leaned heavily against the preparation table while another batch of bread baked inside the ovens. The fires still roared with heat, but the courtyard air no longer felt completely unbearable. Nebu carried empty grain sacks toward the storeroom with slower steps now. His face and arms were streaked with flour and ash. Sweat had dried into pale lines across his skin. For a few moments, the workers spoke quietly among themselves. Small tired conversations. How much grain remained? Which deliveries were expected tomorrow? Whether the fishermen had brought enough catch from the river. Simple things spoken softly while hands continued working. Nearby, one baker removed round loaves from the oven using a long wooden paddle darkened by years of fire and smoke. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the courtyard once more. Warm. Comforting. Familiar. Outside the kitchens, servants crossed the temple grounds carrying empty offering trays back toward the washing areas. Clay bowls clicked softly together as they walked beneath the growing shadows of the columns. The stone beneath their sandals still radiated warmth from the long day. Yet overhead, the sky had begun changing color little by little. The deep burning brightness of noon was fading into softer gold. In the market district, more people emerged again into the streets after resting through the worst heat. Merchants uncovered goods that had been protected beneath cloth earlier in the day. The market slowly regained its voice. Not loud. Never hurried. Only alive again. A vegetable seller rearranged onions into careful rows while a nearby fish merchant brushed flies away from baskets resting on damp reeds. Water sellers crossed the dusty paths offering cups to thirsty workers finishing the day's labor. Children wandered between the stalls carrying scraps of bread. An old dog slept beneath a cartwheel without moving. The smells of evening slowly replaced the dryness of midday. Cooking fires beginning again. Fresh bread from household ovens. Smoke drifting upward between rooftops. Warm figs and dates laid out upon woven mats. Near the edge of the market, a sandal maker sat cross-legged repairing worn leather straps while golden light touched the wall behind him. His fingers moved slowly but carefully despite the tiredness in his eyes. Everywhere in the city, people carried the weight of long labor. Yet evening brought gentleness with it. At the riverbank, Didu finally woke from his daytime sleep beneath the reed shelter. For several moments he remained still, listening to the water moving nearby. The Nile sounded calmer near evening. Softer somehow. The harsh brightness reflected from the river earlier had begun fading now into gold and copper colors beneath the lowering sun. Didu sat upright slowly and stretched sore muscles in his back and shoulders. Nearby, the fishing nets hung drying from wooden poles while insects moved lazily through the warm air. The smell of mud and river plants surrounded the shore. A few children played near the water's edge while an older fisherman repaired a cracked oar beside an overturned boat. Soon the fisherman would prepare for another night upon the river. But not yet. Evening still lingered gently over the valley. Farther outside the city, Beckett and his sons had returned to the fields after resting during the hottest hours. They worked beside the canals gathering the final vegetables before sunset. The fields glowed warmly beneath the lowering sun. Palm trees stretched long shadows across the irrigation ditches. Water reflected golden light through the reeds. Birds had begun singing again now that the worst heat had passed. Beckett lifted baskets of onions onto a wooden sled while his youngest son carried bundles of herbs tied together with reed fibers. Their movements remained slow from exhaustion, but evening air made labor easier to endure. Nearby, frogs stirred again beside the canal banks. The smell of wet earth rose softly through the warm breeze. Back within the temple sanctuary, Panasi prepared the evening rituals in the cool dim chamber where oil lamps flickered gently against painted walls. The atmosphere inside the sacred halls changed with the setting sun. Shadows deepened. Firelight became stronger. The scent of incense drifted more noticeably through the still air. A servant entered carrying fresh oil for the lamps while another removed wilted flowers from earlier offerings. The lotus blossoms had begun curling at the edges after the long heat of the day. Tiaa stood nearby sorting the remaining fresh flowers into smaller arrangements for the evening tables. Her daughter gathered fallen petals carefully from the stone floor. The sanctuary remained peaceful despite the endless labor surrounding it. Outside the inner halls, workers cleaned offering trays beside large basins filled with water carried earlier from the Nile. The splashing sounds echoed softly through the corridors. One older servant rubbed tired wrists while stacking polished bowls against the wall to dry. The temple never truly rested. Even while one set of rituals ended, preparations for the next quietly began. In the storage halls, scribes finished afternoon counts before the coming night. Grain sacks were checked carefully. Beer jars inspected for broken seals. Oil containers moved deeper into cooler sections of the storerooms. The elderly scribe wiped dust from his papyrus sheets while warm evening light entered through a narrow opening high in the wall. The air smelled thick with grain and clay. Nearby, two laborers carried baskets of dried figs toward the kitchen stores. Their shoulders bent beneath the weight while sweat darkened their clothing. No task seemed grand inside the temple. Yet together these ordinary movements sustained the sacred world itself. As the sun lowered farther, the city softened more and more. Families climbed onto rooftops to feel the evening breeze. Women prepared the night meal beside small clay ovens. Smoke drifted upward into the changing sky. Children grew quieter with tiredness after the long day. The colors of Egypt deepened beautifully during these hours. Golden walls. Blue shadows. Orange reflections across the Nile. Dark green palms beside the water. Even the dust in the streets glowed softly beneath the light. Near the bakery courtyard, Hori finally stepped away from the ovens and sat beside the outer wall holding a clay cup of watered beer. His body felt completely drained. Nearby, Nebu rested against stacked firewood with closed eyes for a few moments before another worker called him back toward the ovens. More bread still needed baking for the evening meals and tomorrow's offerings. The work continued. Always. Across the riverbank, Fishermen began gathering their nets once more while the first stars slowly appeared above the eastern horizon. Boats creaked softly against wooden posts. Birds crossed low over the water. The Nile reflected the fading sunlight like moving bronze beneath the darkening sky. And throughout the ancient city, ordinary workers prepared quietly for another night and another dawn of offerings beside the endless river. As evening settled fully across the Nile Valley, the heat of the day slowly loosened from the stone walls and dusty streets. The sky above the city deepened from gold into soft shades of blue and violet. One by one, the brightest stars began appearing above the river while the final sunlight lingered faintly along the western horizon beyond the desert hills. The town grew quieter. Not silent. Never completely silent. But softer. The sharp sounds of daytime labor faded into slower evening rhythms carried gently through the warm air. In the market district, merchants packed away the last of their goods beneath flickering oil lamps. Baskets of onions disappeared into storage rooms. Fish sellers covered their remaining catch with damp cloth. Woven shades were lowered against the cooling night breeze. Dust settled slowly over the streets where crowds had passed all day. A tired donkey stood motionless beside an empty cart while its owner tied bundles of reeds nearby. Children wandered sleepily beside their parents carrying scraps of bread or figs from the market. The smells of night slowly replaced the heat of afternoon. Cooking fires. Warm lentils. Fresh bread. Lamp oil. Smoke drifting upward between rooftops. From open doorways came the low murmur of families sharing meals after the long day. Inside one small home near the edge of the city, a woman stirred lentils in a clay pot while her husband repaired fishing nets beside the doorway. Their children sat nearby eating quietly from shared bowls while shadows flickered against the mud brick walls from a single oil lamp. Simple evenings like these filled the city. Tired bodies. Warm food. Quiet voices. The comfort of routine after exhausting labor. Across the rooftops, families spread woven mats and blankets beneath the open sky. Water jars wrapped in damp cloth were carried upward before sleep. The breeze above the streets felt cooler and cleaner than the trapped warmth inside the homes below. People preferred the rooftops whenever possible. From there they could hear the distant Nile moving through the darkness. Near the temple complex, the sacred halls glowed softly from oil lamps burning behind tall stone doorways. The outer courtyards had grown calm now that the busiest hours had passed. Temple guards walked slowly through the shadows carrying spears and small lamps. Their footsteps echoed gently against the stone. Inside the bakery courtyard, the oven still burned. Hori sat beside the wall drinking the last of his watered beer while another worker removed evening loaves from the fires. The bakery remained unbearably warm compared to the cooling streets outside. Smoke drifted upward into the darkening sky. Nebu carried baskets of finished bread toward the kitchen stores with tired dragging steps. His arms and shoulders ached from the endless labor of the day. Yet tomorrow's work had already begun. Fresh grain waited nearby. Stacks of firewood rested against the wall. Clay bowls soaked in water beside the preparation tables. Nothing inside the temple truly stopped. Nearby, brewers sealed the final beer jars before night. Thick smells of barley and yeast filled the brewery chambers while workers wiped spilled grain from the sticky floors. One brewer stretched his sore back and laughed quietly at something another man whispered beside the vats. Small moments of lightness appeared more often during evening. The hardest part of the day had passed. Inside the sanctuary, Painasi moved slowly through the dim halls lighting additional lamps for the evening rituals. Their flames reflected softly across painted walls filled with sacred figures and stars. The chamber felt peaceful now. Cool stone beneath sandals. Incense drifting gently through still air. Low firelight flickering across polished offering bowls. TIAA arranged fresh lotus flowers near the smaller evening tables while her daughter collected wilted petals into woven baskets. The scent of the blossoms mixed beautifully with incense and lamp oil. For a few moments, the sanctuary felt almost separate from the rest of the world outside. No shouting. No heavy lifting. Only quiet ritual continuing beneath the glow of firelight. Beyond the temple walls, the Nile reflected the first bright stars of night across its dark surface. Didu and the fishermen prepared their boats once more beneath the moonlit shore. Nets were folded carefully into the hulls while small lamps were tied near the front of the boats. The river breeze touched their faces softly. After the heat and dust of daytime, the Nile at night felt gentle and alive. One fisherman pushed the boat outward while another climbed inside carrying baskets lined with reeds. Wood scraped softly against mud. Water splashed quietly around the sides. Soon the current carried them away from shore into darkness. The city lights behind them flickered faintly along the riverbank. Farther away in the farming villages, Beckett finished feeding the animals before climbing onto the rooftop beside his family. The night sky above the fields stretched enormous and clear. Palm trees swayed softly near the irrigation canals. Frogs called steadily from the reeds. The smell of wet earth lingered pleasantly in the cooling air. Beckett lay back against a folded blanket and looked upward toward the stars while his youngest son slowly drifted to sleep beside him. Tomorrow would bring another long day beneath the sun. But for now, the fields rested quietly. Back within the temple storerooms, the final records of the day were being completed. The elderly scribe bent over his papyrus sheets beside a small lamp whose flame flickered each time warm air moved through the room. His fingers were stained dark from ink and dust. He wrote slowly now. Fatigue had settled deep into his bones. Nearby, laborers sealed the last grain stores before night while mice rustled softly somewhere deeper among the stacked sacks. The smell inside the storerooms remained heavy and dry. Grain. Clay. Old wood. Dust warmed by years of heat. At last, the wooden doors were closed and secured for the evening. Elsewhere, temple servants washed offering bowls beside water basins beneath the open sky. Reflections from nearby lamps shimmered across the surface of the water while voices drifted softly through the courtyard. One servant hummed quietly while stacking polished cups onto wooden shelves. Another sat briefly beside the basin rubbing sore feet before returning to work. Even now, labor continued. The temple demanded endless care. Near midnight, many of the city's sounds had faded completely. Markets stood dark. Cooking fires dimmed into glowing embers. Dogs curled asleep beneath carts and stairways. Only the river, insects, distant voices, and occasional footsteps remained awake beneath the stars. Painacy extinguished several lamps inside the sanctuary until only a few sacred flames remained burning in the darkness. The painted walls disappeared slowly into shadow. The scent of incense lingered faintly in the cooling air. Outside the temple, rooftops filled with sleeping families beneath the night sky. Some shifted softly beneath linen blankets while others rested motionless after the long exhausting day. The Nile continued flowing through the darkness beside them all. Quiet. Ancient. Endless. And somewhere deep within the temple bakery, beside warm ovens glowing softly beneath layers of ash, Nebu had already fallen asleep against stacked firewood while tomorrow's offerings waited silently for dawn to return once again over Egypt. The night deepened slowly over the Nile Valley. One by one, the final lamps inside the temple halls burned lower until their small flames became soft points of gold surrounded by shadow. The painted walls of the sanctuary disappeared into darkness. The scent of incense lingered gently in the cool stone air, mixed faintly with old smoke, dry grain, and lotus blossoms left from the evening offerings. Outside, the city slept. Families rested quietly upon rooftops beneath woven blankets while the warm night breeze drifted softly through the narrow streets below. The markets stood empty now. Clay jars rested beside silent stalls. Donkeys slept beside wooden carts covered in dust from the long day. Far away, the fishermen floated upon the dark Nile beneath the stars, their small boats moving slowly with the current. Water touched the reeds along the riverbank with soft endless sounds that had filled the valley long before temples rose beside the shore. In the bakery courtyard, the ovens had faded into deep red embers beneath white ash. The smell of warm bread still lingered faintly in the air while tired workers slept nearby for a few short hours before dawn would wake them once more. Hori rested with aching hands folded across his chest. Nebu slept against stacked firewood beneath the quiet stars. Painasi sat alone for a final moment inside the sanctuary, listening to the silence surrounding the offering tables now emptied for the night. Beyond the temple walls, beyond the fields and villages, beyond the desert hills, Egypt itself seemed to breathe slowly beneath the moonlight. The river flowed onward. The palms swayed softly in the darkness. Frogs called gently from the canals. A cool wind crossed the water and moved through the sleeping city. And somewhere far above the Nile, beneath the endless ancient stars, the quiet world of workers, bakers, fishermen, servants, scribes, and farmers drifted peacefully into another night beside the river. The temple rested. The city rested. The offerings waited silently for another sunrise that would come softly over the waters of the Nile. And little by little, as the warm desert wind moved gently through the darkness, the ancient world faded into stillness and sleep.